Gideon Strathmore slammed the satchel of money onto the table, so hard the lamp rattled. "Take it," he said. "Take your daughter, take your wagon, and be gone from my land before Sunday." Wade Holleran didn't move. He stood with his hat in his hands, looking at more cash than he'd seen in 3 years of riding from one broke outfit to another, and he didn't reach for a single dollar. "You think I'm buying you off?" Gideon's voice dropped to something quieter and meaner. "I'm not. I'm giving you a chance to do right by that little girl before my patience runs out, and I do something neither of us will be comfortable with." From the doorway, 7-year-old Maisie watched her father's back go rigid. She didn't understand every word, but she understood enough. If you've never seen a man refuse a fortune for the sake of a child's happiness, stay with us. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a single moment of this story, and hit that like button right now. Drop your city and country in the comments below. We want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Because what happens next, inside Red Willow Ranch, will break your heart before it puts it back together again. The morning Wade Holleran rode through the gate of Red Willow Ranch. The sky was the color of dirty pewter, and the wind coming off the Rockies carried the first real bite of a Montana winter. He'd been watching that sky for 2 days, reading it the way a man reads a bad debt, with the particular dread of someone who knows it's coming and can't do a thing to stop it. Maisie sat on the wagon bench beside him, wrapped in a wool blanket that had belonged to her mother. She hadn't complained once in 4 days of traveling. That was the thing about Maisie that worried Wade most, not her crying, but her silence. 7 years old, and she already knew when to stop asking for things. "Is this it?" she said, looking at the big timber gate with a burned-in brand above it. "This is it. It's big. Yeah. Are they going to let us stay?" Wade didn't answer right away. He clicked the horse forward through the gate instead, buying himself a few seconds to think of something that wasn't a lie and wasn't false hope either. He settled on, "We're going to ask politely." Maisie looked up at him. "And if they say no, then we ask the next ranch." She nodded and pulled the blanket tighter and didn't say anything else. Wade felt that familiar hollow thing open up in his chest, the one that had lived there since Clara died, the one that nothing seemed to close except the sight of Maisie doing something ordinary, like eating breakfast or falling asleep with her boots still on. He'd heard about Red Willow from a drover in Miles City who said the Strathmores ran the tightest outfit in the territory and paid fair wages and kept a bunkhouse that didn't have holes in the roof. That last part mattered more than he would have admitted out loud. He'd spent one winter in a bunkhouse with holes in the roof, and he was not willing to put Maisie through the same. The yard was wide and working orderly, not pretty, but organized in the way that told you money was present and people knew how to use it. Corrals on the west side, holding maybe 40 horses. Barn big enough to house twice that. A main house built from actual lumber, not just logs, with glass windows and a covered porch. 3 hands crossing the yard stopped when they saw the wagon and watched with the frank assessment of men who've seen drifters come and go and have developed opinions about both. Wade pulled up near the barn and set the brake. A man came out of the barn doorway, wiping his hands on a piece of leather. He was somewhere in his 60s, built like a post that had been put in the ground wet and dried solid, with a gray beard trimmed close and eyes that took inventory of everything they looked at. He wore his authority like a second coat, not loud about it, just there. "Help you," he said. Not unfriendly, not friendly either. "Wade Holleran. I'm looking for winter work. Heard you might need hands." The man looked at Maisie, then at the wagon, then at the single horse tied behind it. He did some arithmetic behind his eyes that Wade had seen done before, and he didn't like the sum it was adding up to. "Gideon Strathmore," the man said. "This is my ranch." He let that sit a moment. "How old's the girl?" 7. "Her mother, 3 years gone." Gideon Strathmore looked at Wade with an expression that wasn't unkind but wasn't soft either. "I run a working outfit, Holleran. Not a charity." "I'm not asking for charity," Wade said. "I'm asking for work. I'll do whatever you need, horses, cattle, fence, whatever's worst on your list. I don't require special consideration, and neither does she. I just need a wage and a dry place for her to sleep that's reasonably close to wherever I'm working. And if I can't provide that, then I appreciate your time, and I'll move on." Gideon studied him for another long moment. Wade sat still and let himself be studied. He'd learned a long time ago that anxious men look desperate, and desperate men don't get hired. You worked horses before? Most of my life. Green ones? Greener the better. I've got patience. Gideon almost said something. Whatever it was, he swallowed it back. He turned toward the barn and said, "Come on, then," without specifying whether he was talking to Wade or the situation in general. Wade climbed down and lifted Maisie from the bench. She stood beside him, holding his hand, looking at everything with those careful eyes she had, the ones that reminded him of Clara so sharply, it sometimes felt like a physical thing. That was when Lenora Strathmore walked out of the barn. She was 27, tall, with dark hair pinned up in the practical way of women who don't have time for nonsense. And she had a smear of something medicinal across the back of her left hand and the direct gaze of someone who's spent years working alongside men and stopped caring what they thought about it. She looked at Wade the way her father had, assessing, nothing wasted, and then she looked at Maisie. And something shifted in her face. Not pity, something quieter than that. "Who's this?" she asked. "My daughter," Wade said. Maisie. Lenora crouched down, surprised Wade, because she did it naturally, without the self-conscious crouch of someone performing kindness for an audience. She looked at Maisie straight and said, "I'm Lenora." "You like horses?" Maisie considered this with the seriousness she gave to most questions. "I don't know very many." "Fair answer," Lenora said. "You want to meet one?" Maisie looked up at Wade. He nodded once. She looked back at Lenora and said, "All right." Gideon watched his daughter lead the little girl toward the nearest corral, and his expression was impossible to read. Wade stood beside him watching too, and the silence between them was the kind that either resolves into conversation or into a decision. "She's good with animals," Gideon said finally, meaning Lenora. "So is Maisie," Wade said, which was mostly hope rather than established fact. Gideon made a sound that might have been agreement. "I've got 3 horses that came to me green and mean, and I've had 2 men try to work them, and both men quit. If you can make something out of those 3 before the real cold hits, I'll pay you standard winter wages and give you the room off the back of the tack shed. Small but tight. Wood stove works, I'll take it. Don't thank me yet. See those horses first." Wade saw them that afternoon. The man wasn't exaggerating, they were a genuine problem. All 3 of them, carrying the particular kind of fear that looks like aggression and usually comes from being handled badly early. The worst of them, a big gray with a scar along his jawline, tried twice to put Wade against the fence inside the first 10 minutes. Wade didn't escalate. He stepped back, waited, and started over from the beginning, which was the part most people skipped. Maisie watched from the fence rail. She'd climbed up there on her own and hooked her heels over the second rail and settled in with the serious attention of a much older observer. Lenora appeared beside her at some point. Wade noticed without making a point of noticing. "He doesn't fight them," Maisie said to Lenora. "No," Lenora said. "The other men fight them. I watched. Papa never fights." "Why do you think that is?" Maisie thought about it. "Because fighting makes them think you're something to be afraid of. And scared things can't learn." Lenora looked at the little girl for a moment. "How old are you?" 7. That's a very grown-up thing to understand. Mama used to say it. About people, not horses. But I think it works for both. Wade, across the corral, heard none of this. But he saw Lenora's expression when she looked at Maisie, and he filed it somewhere careful. The first week was work and nothing else. Wade rose before the other hands and was in the corral by first light. The gray horse remained hostile, but the other 2 were beginning to show the tentative curiosity of animals that want to trust something and haven't yet been convinced it's safe. Wade moved with them in small circles, built a vocabulary out of pressure and release, let them make the decisions, and rewarded the right ones with stillness. Maisie spent her days with Lenora, which had not been planned by anyone, and had simply happened the way certain things happened, the path of least resistance turning out to be the right path. Lenora had a small surgery off the main barn, where she treated the ranch's animals herself, a practical skill she'd developed out of necessity when the nearest veterinarian was 2 days' ride in good weather. Maisie discovered this space on the second morning and stationed herself in it with the territorial confidence of someone who has identified exactly where she belongs. "You can stay if you're quiet," Lenora told her. Maisie was quiet. She watched Lenora treat a colt's infected knee, with the focused attention of someone memorizing a procedure, and when Lenora finished, Maisie said, "What's in the yellow bottle?" "Iodine solution." "Why? Because you used it first before the other one." "So it must be for cleaning." "That's right. And the bandage you went around twice." "Pressure and stability. One layer isn't enough for a joint." Maisie nodded, as though this confirmed something. Lenora looked at her with an expression she didn't quite manage to hide, something between amusement and the particular warmth of a woman who had quietly, without planning to, begun caring about this small, serious person. By the end of the first week, Maisie knew the names of 12 horses, the location of every supply in Lenora's surgery, and the precise time of morning Lenora brought hay to the orphaned foal in the East Pen. She arrived there every morning 3 minutes before Lenora did, which Lenora noticed, but didn't mention. Wade noticed Lenora not mentioning it. He had begun to notice quite a few things about Lenora Strathmore that he would have preferred not to notice, given the basic arithmetic of his situation. She was the rancher's daughter, and he was the broke hired hand with a child and no land and prospects that depended entirely on 3 difficult horses coming around before spring. There was no version of the math that worked in his favor. He noticed anyway. He noticed that she never spoke to the hands with condescension, which was rarer than it should have been, in a woman raised with her kind of money. He noticed that she worked past dark in her surgery without complaint, and that she ate her meals in the kitchen with the hand more often than she ate in the main house with her father. He noticed that when she laughed, which was not frequent but was genuine, when it happened, it was at things that were actually funny, rather than things she was supposed to find charming. He noticed the way she looked at Maisie, and he told himself, with the firmness of a man delivering bad news to himself, to stop noticing. It was Maisie who made that impossible. On the 9th day, she came to find him at the corral in the early afternoon, which was unusual because she understood his working hours and didn't interrupt them. "Papa, what's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. I want to tell you something." He came to the fence rail. "Tell me." Maisie looked at her hands. "Lenora showed me how to brush Nell today, the nervous one. She said most people go too fast with nervous animals because they want to get done, but that's backwards, because going slow is what gets it done faster in the end." "That's true," she said, Mama's thing. "Almost exactly." Wade went still. "She didn't know it was Mama's thing," Maisie said quickly, not wanting him to think she'd said something that caused trouble. "She just said it because it's true, but she said it exactly like Mama would have said it." She looked up at him with those careful eyes. "I like her, Papa." Wade kept his voice level. "I'm glad you've got a friend here." "She's not like a friend," Maisie said with the absolute precision of a child who means exactly what she says. "She's like something else." Wade didn't ask what. He wasn't sure he was ready for the answer. That evening at supper, Gideon Strathmore mentioned, with the casual ease of someone who'd been planning the sentence all day, that Roland Keswick would be coming through Red Willow in 10 days. Gideon said it to the table in general, but the comment was addressed specifically at Lenora, who received it the way she received most things from her father, with a flat, neutral attention that gave nothing back. "Roland's bringing 2 of his men to look at the West herd," Gideon said. "I expect we'll have a proper dinner." "Fine," Lenora said. "He's asked after you. I'm sure he has." Gideon cut his meat. "He's a good man. Good operation. His father built something real." "His father built it," Lenora said. "I've not seen much evidence Roland can maintain it. He's young. He'll grow into it." Lenora looked at her father for a moment with an expression that was not quite argument and not quite agreement, and contained enough of both to be unsettling. Then she looked back at her plate. Wade, sitting at the far end of the table with the other hands, watched this exchange with the careful attention of someone who'd learned that the most important conversations happen at the edges of other conversations. He didn't know who Roland Keswick was, but he understood Gideon Strathmore a little better after watching that exchange. This was a man who had a plan, and who was patient enough to work it through normal channels before trying anything else. That was the kind of man Wade had learned to watch. The gray horse was the breakthrough. It came at the end of the second week, on a gray morning that matched his color, and it happened the way all real breakthroughs happen, not dramatically, but quietly, like a decision being made. Wade had been standing in the center of the corral for 20 minutes, not approaching, just being present. when the horse walked toward him. Not far 4 steps and stopped. Wade didn't move. The horse dropped his head, raised it, dropped it again. Wade lifted one hand, palm out, and waited. The horse put his nose against Wade's palm. It lasted maybe 3 seconds before the horse decided he'd been too trusting and moved off. But those 3 seconds had happened, and both of them knew it. From the fence, Lenora said quietly, "There it is." She'd been watching for 40 minutes without making a sound. Wade hadn't known she was there. "Takes as long as it takes," he said. "My father's been after those 3 horses for 6 months. He was in a hurry." Lenora leaned against the fence rail. "You're never in a hurry. Can't afford to be. With horses or most other things." She was quiet for a moment. Most men don't understand that patience is a skill. They think it's a personality type. Either you've got it or you don't. "What do you think?" "I think you build it," she said. "Usually because you had to." Wade looked at her then. The light was flat and winter gray, not flattering to anything, and she looked honest in it. Not beautiful in the decorated way of women who put effort into it, but real in a way that was more unsettling than beauty. "You're right about that," he said. They stood on either side of the fence in the cold morning air, and neither of them said what either of them was thinking, and both of them knew exactly what the other one was thinking. That was the problem. Maisie noticed before anyone would have expected her to. Children in uncertain circumstances develop an early radar for emotional weather they've had to. She had been watching her father for 12 days with the attention she gave to the gray horse, looking for the small signals that most people missed. She saw the way he tracked Lenora across a room without appearing to. She saw the way he didn't laugh at the other men's jokes the same way when Lenora was present. She saw the way he looked at the ground after Lenora said something that landed. Filed all of it, and she made a decision. On a Saturday afternoon, when most of the hands were doing their own business, Maisie found Lenora in the surgery working on a ledger of medical supplies. She came in without knocking, which was her established habit, and climbed onto the stool she'd adopted as her own. She sat there for a while in the comfortable silence they'd built together. Then she said, "Do you like my papa?" Lenora didn't look up from the ledger. "Your father's a good man and a good worker. That's not what I asked." Lenora set down her pen. She looked at Maisie with a directness she gave everything. And she said, "What made you ask that?" "'Cause he likes you," Maisie said simply. "And he doesn't like many people. He's careful about it. He's careful about everything." "Yes," Maisie agreed, "but especially people, because of Mama." Lenora was quiet. "He won't say anything to you," Maisie continued, with the steady logic of someone presenting evidence. "Because he thinks you're too good for us. That's what he thinks when he doesn't know I'm listening." She looked at Lenora carefully. "I don't think that's right, that you're too good for us. Maisie, I think you're just different from us. That's not the same thing." Lenora looked at this 7-year-old for a long moment. Something moved through her face that she didn't quite close off in time, a complicated thing made of recognition and tenderness, and the particular ache of someone who has been careful and measured for a long time and is tired of it. "Your papa would not be happy you're having this conversation with me," Lenora said carefully. "Probably not," Maisie agreed. "But I wanted to tell you anyway." She picked up the pen Lenora had set down and examined it. "Just in case you were wondering." She set the pen back down, slid off the stool, and left. Lenora sat in the surgery for a while after, not looking at the ledger. Wade found out about that conversation 3 days later, when Maisie told him herself, matter-of-factly, the way she reported most things. His response was a sustained silence, during which Maisie watched him with the calm patience of someone who has already calculated the possible reactions and is waiting to see which one arrives. "You shouldn't have done that," he said finally. "I know." "Are you angry?" He stopped. Started again. "You can't manage adults, Maisie." "I wasn't managing, I was informing. That's a fine distinction." "Papa." She looked at him with a patience that was slightly heartbreaking. "You work so hard to make things okay for me. I just wanted to try to make something okay for you." Wade looked at his daughter and felt the hollow thing in his chest do something complicated, not close exactly, but shift. Like something moving to accommodate something new. He put his hand on top of her head, briefly, the way he did when words weren't quite adequate. "Thank you," he said. "Don't do it again." "All right," she said, without quite committing to it. That evening, Wade found Lenora in the barn, checking on the orphaned foal. He came in without particular purpose and stood nearby watching the foal nurse from the bottle, which it was now doing with considerably more confidence than it had 2 weeks earlier. "He's stronger," Wade said, finally eating properly. She adjusted the angle of the bottle. "Took long enough. These things do." She glanced at him sideways. "Told you. She tells me most things, eventually." "I wasn't going to do anything with it," Lenora said. "What?" she said. "I wasn't planning to make something out of it." "I know, but I want you to know that what she said wasn't—" She stopped. The foal pulled at the bottle. It wasn't unwelcome. Wade looked at his boots. "Lenora, I'm not in a position to—" "I know what position you're in," she said, not unkindly. "I'm not asking for anything. I'm just being honest. Because I think you deserve honest and don't usually get it from people." She looked at him directly. "You're a good man, a genuinely good man. That's rare enough to notice. You make it sound like I'm a dying breed." "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe just a well-hidden one." The foal finished, and she set the bottle down, and they stood in the comfortable, near dark of the barn, and neither of them did the obvious thing, and both of them felt the weight of not doing it. And both of them went to their separate beds thinking about it. Gideon Strathmore was not a man who missed things happening in his own barn. Roland Keswick arrived on a Thursday in the hard cold of mid-November. He was 31, well-dressed in the ostentatious way of men who want you to notice their money before their character, with a handshake that was too firm in the deliberate way, and the ease of someone who has never lost an argument because the rooms he has arguments in belong to him. He looked at Lenora the way a man looks at something he's already decided he's going to acquire. Wade watched that look from across the yard and felt something he didn't have a comfortable name for settle into his jaw. Dinner that evening was formal in the way Gideon could arrange when he decided it mattered. Roland sat at Gideon's right hand and spoke with the expansive confidence of a man performing for an audience, and the audience was largely Lenora, who listened and responded and gave nothing away. Wade was not at dinner. Hands didn't eat at the main house for company dinners. He ate in the kitchen with 2 of the other men and heard the muffled shapes of conversation from the dining room without hearing words. Maisie was in the kitchen too, which was unusual, but Lenora had quietly arranged it, telling Wade she'd keep an eye on her during the dinner. Maisie sat at the kitchen table eating her supper and listening with the same radar that had been tracking her father. She heard Roland Keswick's laugh, which was large and self-satisfied, carry through the wall 3 separate times. She looked at Wade. "I don't like him," she said in the simple declarative way of children. "You don't know him." "I know the laugh." Wade didn't argue with that. What Maisie heard later, or partially heard, standing in the hallway when she'd gotten up for water and shouldn't have been, there was a fragment of conversation between Gideon and Roland after dinner, when Lenora had stepped out. She heard Gideon say she's particular, always has been. But she's practical when it matters. She heard Roland say, "I'm a patient man," in a tone that made the word patient sound like a different word. She heard Gideon say, "Good. By spring, I think we'll have an arrangement that suits everyone." Maisie went back to her bed. She lay in the dark of the small room off the tack shed that she shared with Wade, and she thought about what an arrangement that suits everyone meant. And the longer she thought about it, the more certain she became that she and her papa were not part of the everyone Gideon had in mind. She didn't tell Wade that night, or the next morning. Carried it for 3 days. It was too long, and it grew in the carrying, the way fears do when they're kept in the dark. On the 3rd day, she overheard 2 of the hands talking near the fence. They weren't being careless, they just didn't think anyone was listening. One of them said, "Keswick will be back before Christmas. Word is Strathmore's all but promised him Lenora." The other said, "She know that? Daughters of men like Strathmore always know. Questions whether they go along or make a fuss. She'll make a fuss. But she'll go along." Maisie walked away from the fence with the controlled, steady pace of someone keeping a lid on something. She did not go to Wade. Wade would be careful and reasonable and explain things to her in the level voice he used when he was managing his own fear along with hers, and she didn't want careful and reasonable. She went to the one place she always went when the world felt like it was tilting. She went to the surgery. Lenora was there, as she almost always was in the afternoons. She looked up when Maisie came in, took one look at her face, and set down what she was doing. Sit down, she said. Maisie sat. And then, to her own surprise and slight embarrassment, she started to cry, which she almost never did. And once she started, she couldn't get it organized enough to stop. Lenora came around the work table and crouched in front of her, that same natural crouch she'd done the first day, the one that wasn't performed, and she took both of Maisie's hands and waited. When the crying settled enough for words, Maisie said, "Are you going to marry Roland Keswick?" Lenora was still. "The men said Papa promised you to him," Maisie said. "An arrangement. Who told you that?" "I heard it." Lenora looked at her for a long moment. "Maisie, I am not going to marry anyone because it's been arranged." "That's not. But is that what your father wants? An arrangement?" Lenora's jaw tightened. She looked at Maisie honestly, because dishonesty with this particular child had always felt both impossible and wrong. "My father has ideas about what my future should look like," she said carefully. "And yes, some of those ideas include Roland Keswick. But you don't want that." "No, I don't." "Does my papa know?" Lenora looked at her for another moment, and her expression was the complicated one again, the one she'd shown in the surgery the day. Maisie asked about Wade. "Your papa knows enough to know his situation," she said. "He's a careful man, Maisie. He won't push where he doesn't think he's welcome." "But he's welcome," Maisie said. The words were fierce and simple and entirely without guile. "He's welcome. He just doesn't know it." Something broke open quietly in Lenora's face. She pulled Maisie forward and held her, not the performed hug of an adult managing a child's feelings, but the real kind, the kind that says, "I need this as much as you do." And Maisie felt it and held on with both arms. They stayed like that for a while. When they separated, Maisie wiped her face with her sleeve and looked at Lenora with the level gaze that always made her seem older than she was. "Please don't go away," Maisie said. "Not like people go away. Not like Mama did. Not like that kind." Lenora pressed her lips together. "I can promise you this," she said. "Whatever happens next, you'll know the truth of it from me. I won't disappear without telling you. That I can promise." It wasn't the promise Maisie had asked for, but it was a real one, and Maisie understood the difference between real promises and false comfort. She nodded. "All right," she said. She slid off the stool, straightened herself up, and walked to the door. "Stop there. Lenora. Yeah, if you ever have to choose between what's expected of you and what you actually want." She paused, 7 years old and ancient in the particular way that loss makes children ancient. "I hope you choose what you want." She went out. Lenora stood in the surgery in the early winter dark and put one hand flat on the work table and breathed. Down at the corral, the gray horse lifted his head in the wind, waiting for something he couldn't name but had begun, tentatively, to expect. Wade found out what Maisie had said to Lenora in the surgery that afternoon, the same way he found out most things too late to do anything useful about it, and from Maisie herself, who delivered the information over supper with the matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting the weather. "I cried in front of Lenora today," she said, spooning beans onto her bread. Wade set down his fork. "Why? Because I was scared." "Of what?" She looked at him, that she was going to marry Roland Keswick, and we were going to lose her. The word lose landed somewhere particular. Wade noticed that the fact that Maisie had said lose her rather than she'd leave or she'd go away. Lose implied ownership, implied belonging, implied that somewhere in the past 4 weeks, without anyone signing papers or making declarations, something had been established between his daughter and Lenora Strathmore that felt, to a 7-year-old, as real as blood. Picked his fork back up, set it down again. "Maisie." "I know," she said. "I know you're going to say I overstepped." "You did overstep." "Yes." She ate her bread, but Lenora wasn't upset about it. She held me and said she'd always tell me the truth. Promised. Wade was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind had picked up, the real Montana kind that didn't apologize for itself. "What exactly did you say to her?" he asked. Maisie told him. All of it, including the part where she'd told Lenora that Wade was welcome and didn't know it. He sat across from his daughter and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, not quite embarrassment, not quite fear, but something adjacent to both, laced through with a warmth he wasn't prepared for. "You can't say things like that to people on my behalf," he said finally. "I know. But Papa," she looked at him with that patience that wrecked him. "Somebody had to. He didn't have an answer for that. He cleared the plates and washed them and put Maisie to bed and went outside in the cold and stood in it for a while, because sometimes the cold was the clearest thinking place he had. The gray horse was visible at the far end of the corral, a pale shape in the dark. Standing still, watching. I know, Wade said, to no one, or maybe to both of them. The following days had a strange quality to them, the quality of things that are changing beneath the surface while the surface itself remains politely ordinary. Wade worked the horses. Maisie kept her station in the surgery. Lenora moved through her days with the same capable efficiency she always had, and if something had shifted in the way she and Wade occupied the same spaces, neither of them put words to it. Words had a way of making things permanent. Permanent things could break. But something had definitely shifted. It showed in small ways that anyone watching carefully would have caught. Lenora started timing her rounds so that she passed the corral in the morning when Wade was working the gray. She didn't always stop. Sometimes she just slowed, watched for a minute, and kept moving. Came. Wade started leaving a coffee mug on the fence rail on the mornings he expected her to pass without saying anything about it. She started picking it up without saying anything about it either. Maisie noticed. She noticed everything. She kept her observations to herself, which required genuine effort, and Wade understood what that effort cost her and was silently grateful. It was on a Tuesday, cold enough that the water in the trough had an edge of ice on it by morning, that Gideon Strathmore came to the corral and watched Wade work for 20 minutes without speaking. Wade knew he was there. He kept working. Eventually, Gideon said, "The gray's coming along. He's getting there, faster than I expected. He just needed someone to stop expecting him to be a different horse." Gideon was quiet at that. Then, "Lenora says you've been letting the girl spend time in her surgery." Maisie found it herself, Wade said. "If it's a problem." "I didn't say it was a problem." Gideon's voice was careful, the way it got when he was working up to something. "Lenora has a way with children. Always has. Her mother was the same." Wade didn't volunteer anything. He let the gray walk the fence line and come back and stop, which it did more willingly now. "She was going to marry a man named Cowboy, 8 years back," Gideon said, without apparent connection to what came before. "Good family, solid land. She called it off 2 weeks before the ceremony and would not discuss it with anyone, including me." He paused. "She's particular. I said that to Roland and I meant it." "I wasn't complaining about it, sir," Wade said, keeping his voice neutral. "Is there something specific you want to say?" Gideon looked at him. "I'm watching," he said simply. "That's what I want you to know. I'm watching everything that happens on my ranch, and I'm keeping my own counsel about it. But I'm watching. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't quite a warning either. It was something complicated than both the statement of a man who has not yet decided what he thinks and is being honest about the not deciding." Wade said, "That's fair." Gideon left. The gray horse watched him go. That evening, Wade told Lenora about the conversation. They were in the barn, tending to the foal, which was now strong enough to be annoying about the bottle, pulling at it and pawing when it was empty, demanding more with the confidence of an animal that had decided the world owed it sustenance. Lenora listened without interrupting. When Wade finished, she said, "He said he's watching." "Yes. That means he's not decided yet. When my father's decided something, he tells you. He doesn't watch." She handed Wade the empty bottle to rinse. "He's looking for a reason to object to you, or a reasons not to." "And Roland Keswick?" She took a breath, let it out. "Roland is my father's plan, not mine. My father believes in plans the way some men believe in weather, like it's going to happen regardless of what you want." "And what do you want?" Wade asked, and he heard the weight in his own voice and couldn't take it back. Lenora looked at him in the low barn light. The foal pushed against her hand, looking for more. She stroked its nose automatically, without looking away from Wade. "I want," she said carefully, "to make my own decisions. About my ranch, about my life, about who I let close to it." It wasn't quite an answer to the question he'd asked. It was the architecture of an answer, the framing, and it left the inside open. Wade understood that and said nothing further, and they stood on either side of the foal, in the warm animal smell of the barn, and the space between them was charged with everything that wasn't being said. He told himself again, firmer this time, to be careful. He was in love with her. He understood that now. He'd been putting different names on it for 3 weeks, calling it admiration, calling it respect, calling it the natural warmth of a man grateful for someone who'd been kind to his daughter. None of those names fit anymore, and he'd stopped trying to make them fit. He was in love with Lenora Strathmore, and he owned nothing. And she was the daughter of the man who'd given him work, and Roland Keswick was coming back before Christmas. He carried that the way he carried most heavy things quietly, without putting it down. It was Lenora who changed the shape of things, not him. She came to the corral on a Thursday morning when the sky was the particular iron gray that preceded real snow, and she didn't slow down and keep moving. Stopped. She leaned against the fence rail with both arms crossed on the top board and watched him work the gray with the settled attention of someone who has decided to be somewhere. Wade brought the horse through a slow figure, using his body position to guide the turns, and the gray was doing it not perfectly, not without small resistances, but doing it, which 2 weeks ago would have been unlikely. When he brought it to a stop, Lenora said, "You should know something." Turned. Her voice had a particular quality, not alarmed, but resolved, like someone who has finished a conversation with themselves and arrived at the other side of it. "I told my father this morning that I will not be entertaining any arrangement with Roland Keswick." Told him plainly and without softening it. Wade held the gray's lead rope and waited. "He did not take it well," she continued. "He said I was being willful and that willful women end up alone. I told him I would rather be alone than managed." She paused. Then he said something about hired help and the importance of knowing one's station, which I understood as a reference to you, even though he didn't use your name. Wade felt the cold settle into his chest. "I want you to know," Lenora said, "that I don't give a single damn about station. I want you to know that because I think you've been carrying around some version of the story where you don't deserve what you want, and I want you to stop carrying it." "Lenora, I'm not asking you to do anything about it right now," she said, cutting him off not harshly, but with the clean efficiency of someone who knows where the conversation will go and wants to redirect it. "I'm just telling you what I told my father, because I think you deserve to know what's happening in your own life." She pushed off the fence rail and walked back toward the barn. Wade stood with the gray horse in the cold and felt the world reorganize itself around him in ways he hadn't given it permission to do, and found he couldn't quite object to it. He told Maisie that evening what Lenora had said, or enough of it the part about not entertaining Roland Keswick. He left out the part about station and the part about deserving what you want, because some things he needed to sit with privately before he could share them. Maisie listened, then said, "I know. You know? Lenora told me this afternoon. She said she'd made her position clear to her father." Wade blinked. "She told you before she told me. She told me differently than she told you, I think. She just wanted me to know that what I was worried about wasn't going to happen." Maisie looked at him. "Kept the promise. About telling me the truth." He sat with that for a moment. The fact of Lenora going to Maisie, making sure the little girl wasn't still carrying the fear she'd cried with in the surgery, it was such a specific and quiet kindness that it hit him sideways. "Papa," Maisie said. "Yeah, I think she loves us." Wade felt his throat close briefly. He kept his voice level. "That's a very big word." "I know." Maisie was calm about it, certain in the way she was certain about things that lived in the obvious, uncomplicated space. "But I think it's the right one. I think she loves us the way you love something you weren't planning to love and then did anyway." He pulled her close with one arm and held her, and she let him, and for a minute neither of them said anything. "What are you going to do?" she asked finally. "I don't know yet." "Are you going to do something?" "Probably." "Good," she said, and wriggled free and picked up her book, as if the matter were essentially settled. The snow arrived on a Friday, not the gentle kind, but the mean Montana kind that comes in hard and fast and doesn't leave for months. By Saturday morning, Red Willow was locked in white, and the wind was working the corners of every building on the ranch. Work continued it always did, but it contracted, pulling inward to the essential tasks: feed, water, shelter, heat. The horses needed more attention in the cold, not less, and Wade was in the barn before dawn and still there after dark. Maisie took it upon herself to bring his meals out to him, which she did with the organized competence of someone running a supply operation. She'd fill a plate in the kitchen, wrap it, and walk it across the yard in the snow with the careful gravity of someone who understood that a man who doesn't eat doesn't work. Lenora noticed this and started timing her own barn visits to coincide with Maisie's meal deliveries, which meant that Wade got his supper and a half hour of company instead of just his supper. He didn't object. He wasn't built for it anymore, the objecting. It was on one of those evenings, crowded together at the small work table in the barn while the snow worked outside, that Wade finally told Lenora the truth of it, not the abridged version, not the managed version, but the actual thing. After Clara died, he said, without building up to it, I made Maisie a promise. I told her I wouldn't build her hopes around anyone, that I wouldn't let her get attached to a situation that could disappear. He kept his eyes on his coffee. I meant it. I meant every word of it. Lenora was quiet, listening. I have broken that promise, he said, not because I was careless. Because I watched you with her, and I watched her with you, and I could not in good conscience call what was growing between you two a danger. It didn't feel like a danger. It felt like the opposite. He looked at her then. I don't own land. I've got wages and a horse and what's in the wagon, which isn't much. I'm not going to stand here and pretend I've got something to offer a woman in your position, because that would insult both of us. He paused. But I am going to tell you that I'm in love with you. Not as a strategy, not as an ask, just as the truth, because you told me you wanted the truth from people, and I think you deserve to get what you ask for. The wind hit the barn wall, and the whole structure groaned softly. Lenora looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, Are you finished? Yes. Good. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, flat and deliberate. I don't care what's in the wagon. I don't care about the land. I care about what you just said, and the way you said it, which is the most honest thing anyone has said to me in longer than I can remember. Her hand stayed where it was. I'm in love with you too. Both of you. I know that's an unusual thing to say, but I'm not in love with you and then separately managing some obligation to Maisie. She got there first, if I'm being accurate, and you followed. Something crossed her face, complicated and real. And that's the thing I wasn't expecting. I wasn't expecting to love a child that wasn't mine so quickly that it scared me. That's what happened. Wade turned his hand over under hers. Lenora, he said, my situation is not going to become convenient. Not soon. Not maybe ever. I know, your father. Is my father and not my warden. Her voice was quiet but certain. I'm 27 years old. I've run half this ranch for 3 years without credit for it. I love my father. I also know exactly what he's capable of when he thinks he knows best. She met his eyes. He doesn't always know best. They sat across from each other at that small table in the cold barn, with the snow pressing against the walls and the horses shifting in their stalls, and neither of them leaned across the table, because neither of them was in a hurry. And they'd both learned in different ways and at different costs that the things worth having were worth the patience of doing right. Gideon found out the way men like Gideon always found out things not from the parties involved, but from the shape of the world around them. He didn't need anyone to tell him. He had eyes. He'd been watching. He didn't say anything immediately. He let a week pass, and then another, and his silence on the subject was louder than most men's speeches. The hands on the ranch felt it. They knew better than to speculate openly, though plenty of it happened in low voices after lights out. Roland Keswick came back on a Tuesday, as promised, with 2 men and an air of comfortable certainty. He had dinner at the main house. He spent 2 hours with Gideon going over numbers and landlines and future possibilities. Lenora sat through dinner with the same flat, neutral attention she'd given the first visit, and then excused herself early. Roland noticed the early exit. He said something quiet to Gideon about it, which Gideon received without expression. After Roland retired, Gideon found Lenora in the library, closed the door, sat down, looked at his daughter with the particular look of a man who has been patient long enough and has decided that patience has produced insufficient results. I want to talk about Wade Holleran, he said. All right. He's a good worker. I won't dispute that. The horses are coming along in a way I didn't expect. Yes. He's also a man without land, without savings, and without prospects beyond what I choose to pay him. He has a child. He has no family nearby. He has nothing to recommend him as a husband for my daughter, except. He stopped. Except? Lenora said. Gideon's jaw moved. except that he's the kind of man I would have wanted to be when I was young and didn't have sense enough to choose it. He said it like it cost him something. That doesn't change the practical reality. It changes everything, Lenora said. That's precisely what changes everything. Lenora, Roland Keswick is going to lose his family's operation inside of 10 years, she said, with the flat certainty of someone who has run numbers and drawn conclusions. He's been mismanaging the water rights on the east side for 2 seasons. He's extended his cattle loans past what the land can support. He looks prosperous because his father built something solid enough to withstand a certain amount of incompetence, but there's a bottom to that. She looked at her father. You're not actually choosing between a rich man and a poor one. You're choosing between a man who'll stay poor and a man who'll become poor. And I know which one I trust. Gideon was quiet for a long moment. You've been paying attention, he said. I always pay attention, she said. That's what I keep telling you. He stood, walked to the window. The snow was still there, deep and gray in the moonlight, and Red Willow's lights made yellow rectangles across it. I'm not going to pretend I'm comfortable with this, he said to the window. I know. I want him to prove himself. Not for my sake. For yours. He already is, Lenora said, every day. You'd see it if you were looking. I told you I'm watching. Watch closer, she said. He didn't answer that. He went to bed. Lenora sat in the library by herself and felt the particular cold satisfaction of a conversation that has gone about as well as could be expected, and not a single degree better. Wade knew something had shifted in Gideon's approach, though Gideon didn't tell him directly. He felt it in the small assignments that started coming his way, tasks that went beyond horse training, tasks that involved judgment calls and required communication with the other hands. Small things. The kind of trial runs a man conducts when he's not ready to commit to a verdict but is running the evidence. He didn't point it out. He just did the work. The gray horse was fully there now, responsive, willing, still with opinions about certain things, but no longer violent about them. The other 2 had come along behind him, as the more nervous horses always follow the boldest. Gideon had come to the corral twice to watch them work, and had said nothing, which Wade had come to understand as Gideon's version of appreciation. Maisie had taken to riding the most tractable of the 3 on Sunday mornings when the work was lighter, with Lenora walking beside her, hand on the bridle, teaching her to feel the animal's responses through the reins rather than fighting them. Maisie was a natural, which was no surprise. She watched everything before she tried anything, which was the same approach that had made her good at most things she attempted. It was on one of these Sunday mornings that Maisie said something that lodged in Wade's chest and stayed there. She'd brought the horse to a stop and was sitting up there with a confidence she hadn't had 4 weeks ago, and she looked down at Lenora and said, "Do you think we'll still do this in the spring?" Lenora looked up at her. "What do you mean? I mean, will we still be here in the spring?" "Papa and me." She said it without dramatic weight, just a straight question. Sometimes people move on when winter ends. Lenora took hold of the bridle, looking up at Maisie. "Do you want to be here in the spring?" Maisie thought about it seriously. "I want to be wherever you are," she said finally. "That's the answer, really. If you're here, I want to be here. If you were somewhere else." She considered this. "I'd want to be somewhere close to that." Lenora made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite something else. She held the horse's head and let the moment settle. Wade was at the fence. He heard all of it. He watched Lenora's face and saw the thing that moved through it, the same thing that had moved through it in the surgery, that first day, when Maisie had simply stood there and looked at the horses with those quiet, open eyes. He understood then, with a clarity he hadn't had before, what Lenora had meant when she'd said Maisie had gotten there first. Maisie wasn't the attachment on the side of the thing between him and Lenora. Maisie was the center of it. Maisie was the reason the whole thing had room to exist at all, because Lenora had opened herself to that little girl before she'd ever let herself open to him, and the door had stayed open. He wasn't sure whether to be humbled by that or wrecked by it. He settled on both. It was on a Wednesday, 10 days before Christmas, that everything went sideways. Roland Keswick came back without announcement, which was unusual. He came with only one man this time and went directly to the main house. Whatever he said to Gideon was said privately, but the conversation lasted 2 hours, which was 40 minutes longer than their usual business discussions. When Roland came back out, he crossed the yard with the particular stride of a man who has gotten something he wanted, and he looked at the barn at the surgery window, where Lenora's light was visible with the proprietary attention of someone confirming a plan. Wade saw that look from the corral. He felt the hair go up on the back of his neck. That evening, Gideon summoned Lenora to the library after supper. Conversation lasted 40 minutes. Maisie had already gone to bed, or was supposed to have. She had actually paused in the hallway near the library door, which she would later admit to Wade, with the matter-of-fact honesty she always applied to her own misconduct. She heard Gideon tell Lenora that Roland had made a formal proposal not to Lenora, but to Gideon, which was the part that made the conversation complicated in the specific way Lenora had been predicting it would become. She heard Gideon say he's willing to wait until spring. He understands you need time, but he's asked formally, and I've told him the answer is under consideration. She heard Lenora say, with a quietness that was more alarming than volume, you had no right to tell him that. She heard Gideon say, I have every right. You are my daughter, and this is my ranch, and the future of this operation is my responsibility. She heard Lenora say, the future of this operation is mine too. I work it. I run it. I've been running it. Gideon said, then marry a man who can help you keep it. Silence. Then Lenora said, I already know the man I want. And I think, if you stopped managing this situation long enough to actually look at what's in front of you, you'd understand why. She heard the library door. She moved fast back to the room and got into bed with her clothes on and her heart going too fast. She lay in the dark listening to the wind, and she thought about spring and about what happened to people who got attached to a situation that could disappear. She thought about what Lenora had promised her. She thought about her father, the way he looked in the evenings now, softer than when they'd arrived, less held in, less careful, the way a man looks when he's stopped waiting for something bad to happen every moment. She thought about how much she did not want to go back to the wagon. And somewhere in all that thinking, the fear grew past the point where she could hold it quietly. She told herself she was not going to do anything impulsive. She told herself that 3 times, which was twice more than it usually took. And then she got up and got her coat. The snow in the yard was old and hard-packed, deep blue in the last of the evening light. The mountains north of Red Willow showed their teeth against the sky. The wind was serious, not the worst she'd felt, but close, and it was getting dark faster than she'd planned for. She didn't think she was going far. She told herself she just needed to think somewhere that wasn't the 4 walls of that small room, somewhere the walls didn't have all the fears she'd hung on them. She took the small pony from the paddock, the gentle one Lenora used for her morning rounds, the one who'd let Maisie handle him without complaint since the 2nd week. She didn't saddle him properly, just the bridle, because she wasn't planning on going far. She went north. She told herself she'd turn around when she reached the ridge tree, the big cottonwood on the hill that marked the edge of the valley's main pasture, just to the ridge tree and back. The pony went willingly enough for the first half-mile. Then the wind shifted, and the cold hit differently, and the pony slowed and began watching the sky with the particular alertness of an animal that understands weather better than the person on its back. Maisie didn't turn around. She should have. She knew she should have. But the fear in her chest was louder than the sensible part of her, and the sensible part of her was tired anyway. Tired of carrying things quietly and not saying the scared parts. Tired of being 7 and understanding too much and being able to do too little about any of it. She got to the ridge tree. She sat there on the pony in the wind, looking out at the valley at Red Willow's lights, small and yellow in the blue-white dusk, and she let herself feel the full weight of what she was afraid of. Then she turned the pony around, and the pony's front foot broke through an ice shelf on the slope where the snow looked solid but wasn't, and went down hard, and Maisie went over his shoulder into the cold. She wasn't hurt, not badly, not broken, but she was winded and stunned, and the pony scrambled up and stood trembling 6 feet away, and the light was going fast, and the wind was picking up, and she was alone on a hill north of Red Willow with inadequate clothes and no one who knew where she was. She sat up. She looked at the valley lights. She thought, Papa is going to be so scared. And then, because she was 7, and because she had her mother's stubborn practical core, she got to her feet and started walking toward the pony. She was going to be fine. She told herself she was going to be fine. She just needed to get back on the pony before the dark closed all the way in. Back at Red Willow, Wade came to the room to check on her and found the bed empty and the coat gone and felt the bottom drop out of the world. He didn't run. Running would have cost him time he didn't have. He needed to think. And thinking required a few seconds of standing, still in the cold doorway, looking at the empty bed and the coat hook, and doing the math of how long she'd been gone, and where a frightened 7-year-old with a limited understanding of Montana winter would go when she needed to be somewhere that wasn't indoors. North. He knew it without reasoning through it. Maisie had a habit when she was upset of going toward high ground. He'd watched her do it at 3 different ranches over the past 2 years, find the nearest rise and climb it. As if altitude gave her some perspective, the flat ground didn't. She'd talked about the ridge tree twice this week. He'd heard her describe it to Lenora, the big cottonwood on the hill, the way it looked against the sky. He was at the paddock in under a minute. The small pony's gate was open. He saddled his own horse with hands that moved fast and steady, because he would not let them do anything else. He did not waste time on anger, not at Maisie, not at himself for not seeing this coming, not at the situation that had frightened her into it. Anger was a luxury. Right now he had one job. He was leading the horse out of the paddock when Lenora came across the yard at a near run, already in her coat. "She's gone north," Wade said. "Not a question. The small pony's missing." Lenora was already moving toward the barn. "Give me 2 minutes." "Lenora, 2 minutes, Wade." Her voice had no argument in it, just fact. "You don't know that terrain after dark, and I do. 2 minutes." He waited. It cost him something physical to stand still. He counted his breaths instead of the seconds. She came out of the barn on her own horse in under 2 minutes, not quite, but close, and they went north out of the yard without discussing it further, because there was nothing further to discuss. The snow was old and crusted at the edges, where the wind had worked it, and it reflected what was left of the evening light in a flat, directionless way that made distances deceptive. Wade followed Lenora because she'd said she knew the terrain and he believed her, and believing her cost him nothing but the particular effort of a man who is used to being the one who knows the way. They moved fast, not as fast as Wade wanted, because the footing was unpredictable, and a horse down out here would make everything worse. Lenora read the ground ahead of them with the easy authority of someone who has crossed it in bad conditions before, and Wade watched her and followed and kept his mouth shut. "Ridge tree," Lenora said, not looking back. "If she went for high ground, that's where she'd go. She mentioned it to me twice this week." "I know, I was thinking the same." They rode without talking. The wind was picking up the way Montana wind does after dark, not dramatically, but with the patient persistence of something that intends to outlast you. Wade's face went numb at the edges. He tucked his chin down and kept his eyes on Lenora's back, and the ground ahead, and thought about nothing except finding Maisie. He was not going to let himself think about what it meant that Maisie had run. He wasn't going to let himself think about Gideon's library, or Roland Keswick's proprietary look across the yard, or any of the weight that had been building all week. He would think about all of that later. Right now there was only the cold and the dark and the ridge tree somewhere ahead. They heard the pony first, a short, anxious sound from somewhere above them and to the left, the specific vocalization of an animal that is distressed and stationary and wants to be neither. "There," Lenora said. They came up the slope and found the pony standing trembling near the base of the cottonwood, reins trailing, with the particular rigid posture of an animal that has fallen and recovered, and is not sure whether to trust its legs. Beside him, sitting in the snow with her back against the tree's base, was Maisie. She was alive. She was awake. She was looking up at them, with the expression of someone who has had approximately 40 minutes alone in the cold to understand the full scale of what they've done, and is not going to insult anyone by pretending otherwise. "I fell off," she said. Her voice was steady, which cost her something. Wade was off his horse before it fully stopped. He covered the ground between them in 3 strides and crouched in front of her, putting his hands on her face, her shoulders, checking her the way a man checks a thing he cannot afford to lose. "Are you hurt?" His voice came out rougher than he intended. "I'm cold. My knee hurts a little. I'm not broken." She met his eyes. "I'm sorry, Papa." He pulled her against him. She came willingly, which told him more about the state of her than anything else would have. Maisie accepted comfort when she was genuinely scared and deflected it when she was merely inconvenienced. Right now, she pressed her face into his coat and held on, and he held her back, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Lenora had dismounted and gone to the pony. She ran her hands down his legs with the efficient tension of someone assessing damage, and the pony stood and let her, which meant he was better than he looked. "He's okay," she said. "Ice shelf fall. Nothing structural." She looked at Maisie over Wade's shoulder. "That pony's been doing this terrain for 3 winters, Maisie. He knows when to stop." "I know," Maisie said from somewhere inside Wade's coat. "I should have listened to him." "Yes," Lenora said without softening it. "You should have." Maisie didn't argue. She peeled herself away from Wade and sat up straight and looked at Lenora with the honest eyes. "I heard the conversation," she said. "Outside the library. I wasn't supposed to. I wasn't trying to. I just couldn't not hear." Lenora was quiet. "Is your father going to say yes to Roland Keswick?" Maisie asked. The wind moved through the cottonwood above them. The pony stamped one foot. Lenora said, "My father is not going to decide that." "I am." "But he said—" "I know what he said." Lenora came around and crouched in the snow in front of Maisie, the same natural crouch she'd used since the very first day, the one that put them eye to eye. "Maisie, listen to me. I told your father tonight that Roland Keswick's answer is no, and that I will not be revisiting it. My father doesn't like that. He's going to make things difficult for a while." She held Maisie's eyes steadily. "But difficult is not the same as impossible, and I am not going anywhere." "You promised," Maisie said. It came out smaller than she intended. "I promised," Lenora confirmed, "and I keep my promises. Even the ones that inconvenience me." Maisie exhaled a long, unsteady breath that released something she'd been holding since she'd heard that library door. "Okay," she said. "Okay," Lenora said. She stood, pulled off her scarf, and wrapped it around Maisie's neck with the practical efficiency of someone who has already moved past the emotional moment and into the logistical one. "Now can you ride back, or do you go with your father?" "I can ride," Maisie said with the specific dignity of someone who has already admitted enough weakness for one evening. "Good." Lenora helped her to her feet, because that pony did nothing wrong tonight, and he deserves to carry you home properly. They got Maisie onto the pony and started back down the slope. Wade rode close beside her, close enough to reach her if anything went wrong, far enough to let her do it herself. Lenora took the downhill line that avoided the ice shelf, and they followed her down without incident. They were halfway back to the ranch when Maisie said, from her pony, to no one in both of them, "I'm not going to do that again." "Good," Wade said. "I knew it was stupid while I was doing it. That's usually how it works." "I was scared," she said plainly. "I got scared and I did something stupid. I'm sorry." Wade looked at his daughter in the blue dark, riding with her back straight, and Lenora's scarf around her neck, and felt the complicated thing in his chest do its shifting again. He wanted to say something that was both honest and not crushing. He settled on, "Being scared isn't a problem, Maisie. What you do with the scared, that's the part we work on." She thought about that. "What do you do with it, when you're scared?" "Work," he said. "Stay busy, try to be useful." She looked at him. "That's not very healthy, Papa." He heard Lenora make a sound from slightly ahead of them that was not quite a laugh. "No," he said. "Probably not." "Lenora," Maisie said, "what do you do when you're scared?" Lenora considered this seriously. "I tell someone," she said. "Usually the wrong person at first, then eventually the right one." Maisie seemed satisfied with this. She rode the rest of the way in silence, which was a comfortable silence, the kind that meant she was processing rather than suffering. At the ranch, Gideon was standing in the yard. He'd lit one of the yard lamps, and he was standing in its light with his arms crossed, and his expression doing several things at once, relief and anger, and the particular guilt of a man who has considered, in the past hour, whether his library conversation might have contributed to something bad happening to a 7-year-old girl. He looked at Maisie on the pony. He looked at Wade. He looked at Lenora. "She all right?" he said. "She's fine," Wade said. "Cold. Pony fell on an ice shelf, nothing serious." Gideon looked at Maisie directly. That was a fool thing to do. "Yes, sir," Maisie said. "I know." Something in Gideon's expression changed, not softened exactly, but shifted. He looked at this 7-year-old who had agreed with him flatly and without excuse, and he said nothing further on the subject. He said, "Get her inside. Kitchen's warm." He stood in the yard while they took the horses in, and Wade, leading his horse past him, felt Gideon's gaze on his back the whole way. Kitchen was warm, as promised, and someone had kept a pot of soup on the stove, one of the older hands, probably, who'd noticed the horses gone and the lamps, and had made the quiet, practical decision that hot food would eventually be wanted. Maisie ate 2 bowls and fell asleep in the chair beside the stove before anyone suggested she go to bed, and Wade carried her to the room the way he'd carried her when she was 3 and 4 and the world had still been whole. He laid her down and pulled the blanket up and stood there for a moment in the dark, looking at his sleeping daughter with the particular overwhelm of a parent who has just recovered a child from the consequences of his own situation, because that was what this was at bottom. Maisie had run because she was scared of losing Lenora, and she was scared of losing Lenora because she'd been allowed to love her, and she'd been allowed to love her because Wade had not stopped it, because he hadn't been able to make himself stop it, because he'd been selfish enough to want something and careless enough to let Maisie want it too. He stood with that for a while. He didn't make it smaller than it was. When he came back out, Lenora was in the barn checking the pony's legs again by lamplight. Wade came in and leaned against the stall doorway and watched her work. "She's asleep," he said. "Good, Lenora." He waited until she looked up. "What your father said tonight, the arrangement with Keswick. What's the actual situation? Not what you told Maisie to keep her calm. The actual one." Lenora sat back on her heels. She looked at him with the honest eyes she always gave him. "The actual situation is that my father made a commitment to Roland that he didn't have the right to make. Roland has taken it as a semi-formal understanding. My father knows I've refused it, but he believes I'll come around." She paused. "He has historically been right about me coming around, because historically the things he's pushed me toward have been practical, even if I didn't want them. This is different. He hasn't understood yet that this is different. How long before he understands that? I don't know." She stood. "Gideon Strathmore has never been defied in a way that stuck. He's been argued with, negotiated with, worn down over time. But defied completely and without apology." She shook her head slightly. "I'm doing something I haven't done before. I don't know exactly what he's going to do next." "Could he fire me?" Wade asked. She met his eyes. "Yes." The word sat between them. "Could he make it impossible for you to stay?" he asked. "He could try," she said. "He controls the operation. The wages. The housing." She stopped. "He could try," she said again. "I don't think it would work. But I want to be honest about what he could try." Wade nodded slowly. He looked at the pony, who had settled now and was pulling at hay with recovered appetite. "When I was 22, he said, I worked for a man in Wyoming who decided he didn't like the direction things were going between me and a situation on his ranch. He waited until January, until I was 3 months into winter, and had nowhere practical to go, and then he made my position impossible, and waited for the cold to do his arguing for him." Lenora was quiet. "I left," Wade said, "because I didn't have anything worth staying for badly enough to fight a Montana January." He looked at her. "That calculation is different now. Wade, I'm not saying I'm going to be foolish about it. I'm saying I'm not 22 anymore, and the calculation is different." He pushed off the doorway. "I want you to know that. Whatever your father decides to try, I'm not going to be moved by weather." She looked at him for a long moment. Something passed through her face, something that wasn't relief exactly, because relief implies uncertainty had been there before, and she hadn't doubted him. It was more like confirmation, like hearing something spoken that had been true for a while already. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. He went back to the room. He did not sleep well. He didn't expect to. Gideon waited 3 days. 3 days in which everything on the surface of Red Willow went on exactly as usual, the feeding and watering and fencing, and the ordinary cold weather work of a working ranch, while the thing beneath the surface built pressure, the way weather builds, invisibly and then all at once. On the 3rd morning, he came to the corral while Wade was working the gray. The horse was doing a proper figure now, responsive and smooth, carrying himself with the quiet confidence of an animal that has finally found its footing. Gideon watched it for several minutes. "You've done good work on those 3, he said. "Thank you. Better than I expected, honestly." Wade kept the gray moving, slow and steady. "I appreciate that." Gideon put his hands on the fence rail. He looked at the middle distance. Roland Keswick is not coming back, he said. Wade let the gray come to a stop. He turned to look at Gideon. Lenora wrote him a letter, Gideon said, 2 days ago. She didn't show it to me before she sent it. I read the copy she left on her desk. His expression was complicated in the particular way of a man who is both angry about a thing and reluctant to say the thing was wrong. She told him the understanding my father that I implied to him does not exist and never did. She was direct about it, more direct than necessary. He paused. He won't be back. That's her decision to make, Wade said carefully. I know it is, Gideon said, and the words came out like they'd been worked over for 3 days before being released. I know it is. That doesn't mean I have to like it. He turned from the fence and looked at Wade directly. I'm going to say something to you that I want you to hear as to hear is something other than a threat. Can you do that? I can try. I don't know what you are to my daughter. I don't know what she is to you. I have a strong suspicion about both, and my suspicions in these matters have historically been accurate. He held Wade's gaze. What I do know is what I told you 3 weeks ago. I'm watching. And what I've watched is a man who works hard, keeps his word, handles difficult things without drama, and has raised a daughter who has more sense than most adults I know. He stopped. I'm not saying that's enough. I'm saying it's not nothing. Wade said, What are you saying exactly, Mr. Strathmore? I'm saying don't make me regret the fact that I haven't fired you. Gideon's voice was dry, but underneath the dry was something genuine. And I'm saying that if you hurt my daughter, or give her reason to be sorry she defied me for you, I will make your professional life in this territory extremely difficult. I know every rancher from here to the Yellowstone, and I have opinions that carry weight. I understand. Do you love her? Wade said. You've made a mess of how you've shown it, but you love her. I understand that completely. Gideon looked at him for a long moment. He made a sound that was somewhere between acknowledgement and indignation, and then he walked away without another word. The gray horse watched him go with mild interest. Wade stood in the cold and thought about what had just happened and decided it was, on balance, about as good as it was likely to get for the moment. Confrontation, when it finally came, did not happen the way Wade had been expecting it to. He'd been braced for something public or blunt, the kind of ultimatum that Gideon had telegraphed from the beginning. What he wasn't expecting was the satchel. It was a Saturday evening, a week after Maisie's night on the hill. Gideon asked Wade to come to the main house after supper, which was unusual enough that the other hands noticed and said nothing, which was its own kind of noticing. Wade went, cleaned up enough to be presentable, and sat across from Gideon in the library, where Lenora had defied him 2 weeks ago. The satchel was on the table between them. There's enough there to buy a respectable piece of ground in Wyoming, Gideon said. South of Sheridan, good grass, water access. Small operation, but yours outright. No debt. He sat back. I had a banker look into it 2 days ago. It's available. Wade looked at the satchel. He did not reach for it. You're not a stupid man, Gideon said, so I'll be plain. I'm offering you the life you came to Montana Territory wanting. Your own land. A proper home for your daughter. Something with your name on it that can't be taken away by weather or another man's decision. He paused. The condition is that you take Maisie and leave Red Willow before this goes any further. Fire in the library grate moved. Outside, the wind was making its regular argument against the walls. Wade said, If I say no, you fire me. I fire you, and I make it difficult for you to find comparable work in the territory. Yes. Gideon said it without pleasure. I don't like doing it, but I will. Wade looked at the satchel for a long time. He thought about land that had his name on it. He thought about Maisie having a real home, a permanent one, the kind he'd been trying to get her to since Clara died. He thought about what it would feel like to stop moving. He thought about Maisie's face in the cold on the hill, and about what had driven her there. The library door was not fully shut. He hadn't thought about that. He was thinking about it now, because from somewhere in the hallway he heard a small sound, the particular held quality of someone standing very still and trying not to be heard. He waited 1 moment. Then Maisie's voice came through the gap in the door. Quiet and careful, Papa. Would Lenora come with us? He looked at the satchel. He looked at Gideon, who had heard the voice too, and whose face had gone through something brief and complicated. Wade reached for the satchel. He lifted it. He held it for a moment. Then he set it back down on the table and pushed it across to Gideon's side. No, he said. He kept his voice level. Thank you for the offer. But no, Gideon's jaw worked. You understand what I told you. I understand. I'll dismiss you tonight. I understand that too. Gideon looked at him with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite something else. He said, You're going to choose this over a piece of ground with your name on it. I chose it the minute she asked me that question, Wade said. I just needed to hear it out loud. He stood. He went to the door and opened it, and Maisie was there in the hallway. She didn't try to pretend she hadn't been there, because she never pretended things she'd done. She looked up at him with those eyes, and he looked down at her, and she took his hand. It wouldn't be home, she said, small and certain. Not without her. It wouldn't be home. I know, sweetheart, Wade said. I know. He turned back to the library. Gideon was still sitting, looking at the returned satchel. I'll have the room cleared by morning, Wade said. I won't cause trouble on my way out. Gideon said nothing. Wade and Maisie went down the hallway together. They found Lenora in the barn. She was always in the barn when the world was complicated, because the barn was where things made a reliable kind of sense. She was with the foal, who at 6 weeks was now unambiguously sturdy and demanding about it, and she looked up when they came in. She saw their faces. He fired you, she said. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then he offered you money to go. Yes, and you said no. Maisie said no, Wade said. I agreed with her. Lenora looked at Maisie, who was still holding Wade's hand and looking back at Lenora with the level, serious gaze she had for the most important moments. It wouldn't be home, Maisie said simply. Lenora set down the bottle. She crossed the barn floor, and she did something she hadn't done in front of anyone. She put her arms around both of them, Wade and Maisie together, and held on. Maisie made a small sound and held back. Wade put one hand on the back of Lenora's head and stood there in the warm animal dark of the barn, while the wind worked outside, and the foal nosed at the empty bottle, and everything was terrible, and somehow exactly right. I'm leaving with you, Lenora said into his coat. Lenora, don't. She pulled back enough to look at him. Her eyes were dry, but only barely. Don't tell me to stay. Don't tell me it's my home and I should hold it. I know all of that. My decision. Your father will either come to his senses or he won't. Her jaw was set. But he is not going to fire the man I love and then have me continue on as if that's acceptable. That is not something I'm going to do. Wade looked at her. You sure about this? I'm sure about you, she said. The rest of it I'm working out. Maisie, who had been standing quietly through this exchange, said, So we're leaving together. Yes, Lenora said. Good. Maisie released her father's hand and reached for Lenora's instead. That's home then, wherever we are. None of them slept much. Wade packed what little they had, which took less time than it should have, and Maisie helped with the methodical focus she gave to practical tasks. Lenora went to the main house once late, and came back with a bag and an expression that said the conversation with Gideon had happened, and she wasn't ready to describe it yet. They planned to leave at first light. It was the sound that stopped them. Started before dawn, not a single sound, but several at once, overlapping in the way that immediately reads as wrong. Wade was in the yard loading the wagon when he heard it, raised voices from the north, and underneath the voices, the specific percussive disorder of a large group of animals moving in a direction they weren't supposed to be moving. Then he heard the gunshots. 2 of them, warning shots from the sound, not aimed at anything, just the sound a man makes when he's trying to turn something with noise and it isn't working. He looked north. In the gray pre-dawn, he could see them, a dark mass moving wrong against the snow, moving toward the ravine at the edge of the north pasture, where the ground dropped off sharply and the creek below was locked in 3 feet of ice. He stood with his hand on the wagon and understood immediately what he was looking at. And he stood there for a second, knowing that these were not his cattle anymore, and that the man who'd fired him the night before was probably somewhere in that yard watching him, and that the practical and self-interested thing to do was to finish loading the wagon. He dropped the rope he was holding. He turned to Lenora, who had come out at the sound. Maisie, he said. I'll stay with her, Lenora said immediately, because she'd already read it on his face. I need my horse. Go, she said. I'll get her somewhere safe and I'll follow. He went. He rode toward the sound the way he'd ridden toward hard things his whole life, not fast enough to be reckless, not slow enough to be useless, finding the line between the two by feel rather than calculation. The gray horse moved under him with the particular quality of an animal that has finally found its confidence, responsive, and forward. Reading Wade's weight shifts the way it had learned to read everything else over the past 6 weeks. The north pasture opened up ahead of him, and he saw the full shape of it in the gray pre-dawn light, and it was worse than he'd estimated from the yard. Not hundreds of cattle, closer to 400, maybe more, moving in the disordered surge of a herd that has been frightened past the point of normal management. The leaders were already within a quarter-mile of the ravine's edge, and the ones behind them were pushing forward with the blind momentum of animals that can't see where they're going, but can feel the pressure from behind. 3 of Red Willow's hands were working the right flank, trying to turn the leaders, but they were using the wrong approach, pushing hard from the side, which was adding to the chaos rather than reducing it, because a frightened herd doesn't respond to confrontation the way a calm one does. You can't fight that much moving weight. You have to redirect it. Gideon was on horseback near the west fence line, watching, and Wade saw him register the arriving rider and clock who it was, and saw whatever Gideon did with that information get buried under the more immediate problem. Wade pulled up beside one of the hands, a man named Cutter, experienced, who had enough sense to be looking for an answer rather than just riding harder at a problem that wasn't responding to riding hard. "How long have they been moving?" Wade said. 20 minutes, maybe." Fence line on the north boundary was cut 3 sections, clean cut, not drift damage. Cutter's face was tight. Something spooked them from behind, and they've been building since. "Old migration corridor through the east timber, is it still passable?" Cutter looked at him. "The one Strathmore closed off 4 years ago? It goes through the sheltered draw." "Why?" "Because it's wide enough for a herd this size, and it dead ends at the box canyon, which is 3 feet of snow and no exit. They go in there, they stop." Wade was already reading the terrain ahead. "I need 2 riders on the right lead, pushing right at exactly the right angle. Not hard, just enough. I'll take the left lead with the gray." "Strathmore's not going to—" "I don't work here anymore," Wade said. "Ask me later whether I care. Are you in or not?" Cutter looked at the herd moving toward the ravine. He looked at Wade. "Tell me the angle," he said. Wade told him in 30 seconds, the geometry of it, the pressure points, where the turn had to begin, and how hard to push, and how quickly to release. Cutter nodded once and pulled away to get his man. Wade moved the gray into position on the left flank, wide out, far enough that the leaders hadn't registered him yet. This was the part that required patience, the part most riders didn't have because the situation felt urgent, and urgency pushed people to act before the moment was ready. Wade made himself wait. He watched the herd's movement, reading its shape, looking for the natural opening in the pattern, the way he'd learned to read a horse's posture for the moment of readiness. There, the leftmost lead animal hesitated, just for a step, responding to some pressure from the middle of the herd, rather than from outside it. Wade moved the gray. Not fast, just purposeful, cutting a wide arc at the precise angle that introduced him into the lead animal's awareness, as something to move away from, rather than something to move toward. The gray understood what was being asked. It had gray instance of this, it had done smaller versions of the lateral pressure work, and it leaned into the task with the intelligence of an animal that has figured out how to work. The lead animal turned, 1 step right, then another. On the right flank, Cutter and his man were applying their pressure at the angle Wade had specified. And for one long suspended moment, nothing seemed to be changing, and everything was still moving toward the ravine, and the whole thing was tipping toward disaster. Then the second lead animal turned right, then the third. It spread through the front of the herd the way these things spread, not instantly, not smoothly, but with the staggered relay of 300 animals adjusting to new information from the animals immediately ahead of them. Turn wasn't clean. The middle of the herd buckled and pressed, and 2 animals went down briefly and came back up, and the right flank bulged in a way that made Cutter's man pull back too fast, which almost undid the whole thing. Wade pushed the gray harder for 30 seconds harder than he wanted to, harder than was comfortable, asking the horse for more than he'd asked before, and the gray gave it, flat out, and the left lead held, and the turn continued. Corridor through the east timber was 200 yards ahead. Wade had the gray running parallel to the left edge of the herd now, not fighting it, just maintaining the wall of presence that kept the leaders channeled right. And Cutter was doing the same thing on the other side. And between them, the herd was moving the way a river moves when you've built the banks in the right places, not because you've overpowered it, but because you've given it the path of least resistance and let it find its own way there. The first animals entered the timber corridor. The ones behind followed, because animals in a herd follow what's ahead, and what was ahead was timber and shelter and the absence of the wind that had been hitting their left side. The herd slowed naturally as it compressed into the narrower passage, and slowing begat more slowing. And within 4 minutes of the first animals entering the corridor, the back of the herd was still moving, but the front had nearly stopped, jostling and blowing and beginning the slow re-regulation of an animal collective that has passed through fear and is finding its way back to itself. Wade pulled the gray up at the corridor entrance. The horse was blowing hard, lathered across the chest, but sound all 4 legs. No stumble, nothing pulled. Wade put a hand on its neck and felt it heaving. "Good horse," he said. "Good horse." He turned. Gideon Strathmore was 30 yards behind him, stationary, watching. 4 of the other hands had pulled up around him at various distances, and they were all watching too. But Wade was only aware of Gideon, the particular quality of Gideon's attention, which had a weight to it that most men's attention didn't have, and which was fully and completely fixed on Wade right now. Cutter came up alongside Wade, breathing hard. "That was the east migration corridor," he said. "Strathmore closed that off because I know why he closed it off," Wade said. He was watching Gideon. "The fence section? Someone cut it. 3 clean sections, like I said. Wire cutters, not weathering." "Whose sections?" Cutter hesitated. "The cut was from outside the fence line. North boundary, which backs up against the Keswick land." The information settled. Wade looked at Gideon across the 30 yards between them and watched the same information arrive on Gideon's face and do its work there. Lenora was on horseback at the edge of the yard when Wade rode back. She'd settled Maisie with one of the kitchen hands who'd been on Red Willow for 15 years, and who Maisie had decided was acceptable, and she'd saddled her own horse because she'd said she would follow, and she had, arriving at the pasture's edge in time to see the last of the herd enter the timber corridor and to understand from the shape of things what had just happened. She looked at him as he came up. She looked at the gray, which was still blowing. She looked at his face. "The fence was cut from the Keswick side," he said. Closed her eyes. "Opened them. You're sure?" Cutter's sure. "He's the one who found the sections." She let out a breath that was slow and controlled, in the way of someone managing a large feeling carefully. "Roland," she said, not a question. "That would be my read. He needs Red Willow's land. Or he needs Red Willow's operation weakened enough that my father would consider a merger." She said it flatly, working through the logic the way she'd worked through the ledger numbers she'd described to her father weeks ago. If the herd goes into that ravine, the financial damage could be catastrophic. Enough that my father might— She stopped. "He came back here because he thought the arrangement was still possible. When my letter arrived, he decided to create a crisis," Wade said, "and then come back in as the solution." Her voice was very quiet. "Offer to merge operations. Frame it as saving Red Willow." She looked at Wade. "He's not a patient man. He's a calculating one. There's a difference." Gideon arrived at the yard 5 minutes later with 3 of his hands. He came through the gate and pulled up near the barn and swung down from his horse with the stiff, careful movement of a man in his 60s who has been riding hard in cold weather and is feeling every year of it. He looked at Lenora first, then Wade. "Cutter told me what he found at the fence line," Gideon said. "I know," Lenora said. "The angle of the cut, the section spacing, it wasn't random. It was deliberate. Someone knew exactly where to cut to start a drift toward the north pasture, and exactly when to do it. His voice was controlled, but only just. Someone who knows this land. Roland has ridden that boundary 3 times in the past year," Lenora said. "The last time was 6 weeks ago, when you invited him to look at the west herd." Gideon's jaw worked. "He needs money," Lenora continued. "Told you this. His operation is overextended. He's been looking for a way to consolidate, and Red Willow is the obvious candidate because it's solvent and it borders his land, and he thought he had a path through me." She looked at her father directly. When I closed that path, he chose another one. I invited that man into my home, Gideon said. Very quietly, yes. I invited him to look at my operation, my land, my boundaries. His voice had something in it now that was beyond anger, the cold, specific feeling of a man who has discovered that his own judgment has been used against him. I was building him a road into my own house. Yes, Lenora said again. Gideon stood there with that. He stood there for a while. Then he looked at Wade. You saved a herd that wasn't your responsibility anymore, he said. You rode out for cattle that don't belong to you, for a man who fired you the night before. He said it without the softening of a compliment, just as a fact being stated and examined. Why? Wade thought about giving a practical answer. He had a few good ones, reasonable ones, the kind that didn't require explaining anything personal. He decided against all of them, because the herd going into that ravine would have hurt Lenora, he said. And Maisie would have seen it happen from the yard, and she'd have known I rode away instead of doing something about it. Those are the reasons. Gideon looked at him for a long time. Not because you wanted something from me, Gideon said. No, not because you were calculating what it might get you. I wasn't thinking about you at all, Wade said, not harshly, just accurately. Something moved through Gideon's face, several things, in sequence too fast to catalog. He looked at his daughter, who was watching him with the patient attention she'd been giving him her whole life, waiting for him to see what was standing directly in front of him. He looked back at Wade. He said, "Come inside." The kitchen was warm and full of the ordinary morning smell of coffee and wood smoke and the residual tension of a household that has been running on adrenaline since before dawn. Maisie was at the table, with her hands wrapped around a mug of something warm, and her eyes tracking every adult who came through the door with the alert attention of someone monitoring a developing situation. She looked at Wade first. He gave her a small nod, "We're all right," and she relaxed incrementally and went back to her mug. Gideon sat down at the head of the table. He looked like a man who has been carrying something for a long time and has just set it down and is noticing for the first time how much it weighed. "Tell me about the East Timber Corridor," he said to Wade. "Why that and not the standard turn?" Wade explained it, the geometry, the pressure physics of a moving herd, why fighting the front is always wrong, and why the corridor worked precisely because it offered the herd something it wanted rather than something it was being forced toward. He spoke plainly, without performance, the way he talked about horses, as someone who has worked something out through practice rather than theory. Gideon listened. He asked 2 questions, both practical. Wade answered them. When Wade finished, Gideon said, 4 years ago I closed that corridor because I thought it was wasting pasture I could use. I had a man tell me it was a natural safety valve for a panicked herd, and I told him I'd built this ranch without safety valves and didn't intend to start now. He looked at the table. The man quit 6 months later. Good hands don't stay where they're not listened to, Wade said. No, Gideon agreed. They don't. He looked up. I've been right about most things in my life. Enough times that I stopped examining when I might be wrong. He said it without drama, just as in accounting. That's a problem, as it turns out. Lenora, who had been standing by the stove with her coffee, said nothing. She let her father get there without help. The Keswick situation, Gideon said. I want your assessment. Not Lenora's. She'll tell me she told me so, and she'll be right, and I prefer to get to that part after I've heard a less invested opinion. He looked at Wade. You, Wade said. Lenora's read is correct. He needed the operation weakened, or he needed the marriage. When one road closed, he took the other. The fence cut was calculated. You said yourself the section spacing was deliberate, and you're right. That's someone who knew the drift patterns of your north herd and knew where your boundary sat relative to the ravine. He paused. That's someone who had access to your land. He won't come back, Gideon said. Not after this. No, but you should talk to a lawyer about the boundary fences. Document everything Cutter found before the snow covers it. And I'd suggest someone speak to the ranchers on your east and south lines, warn them. If he's this short of money, Red Willow's not the only operation he'd look at. Gideon looked at him. You're advising me on business. You asked. I did. Something crossed Gideon's face that was close to what might have been, in a less complicated man, humor. You're not shy about it. You don't seem like a man who values shyness over usefulness. I don't. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Maisie, who had been sitting at the table through all of this, with the particular stillness of a child who has decided that if she moves, no one will remember she's there and send her out of the room. "You," he said. Maisie looked at him. "Sir, you rode north in a snowstorm because you were scared my daughter was going to leave you." Maisie considered whether to refine this characterization and decided against it. "Yes, sir, that was foolish." "Yes, sir." It was also he stopped. "You said something in the hallway last night about home." Maisie waited. "I heard you," Gideon said. "I wasn't meant to, but I heard." He looked at this 7-year-old with an expression that was working hard to be several things at once, and not quite managing any of them cleanly. "Where's home to you exactly?" Maisie looked at her father, then at Lenora, then back at Gideon. "Wherever they both are," she said. At the same time, the kitchen was very quiet. Gideon looked at his hands on the table. Old hands, work thick, the kind that have closed around 1,000 decisions and 1,000 tools, and built something real from a lot of years of not stopping. "I have spent the better part of 2 months," he said slowly, "trying to move something that did not want to be moved." He looked up at Lenora. "I was trying to build your future the way I built this ranch. Like it was a construction problem." His voice had a roughness in it that was not its usual texture. "Your mother would have told me inside the first week that I was being an idiot." Lenora's expression changed. The set went out of it. "She would have used that exact word," she said. "She usually did." He looked at her. "I miss her judgment. I've been missing it for 12 years, and I've been substituting my own in its place, which is," he shook his head slightly, "not the same thing." Lenora set down her coffee. She crossed the kitchen and sat down beside her father, which she hadn't done in the casual, unremarkable way of a daughter. In a long time, sat down beside him without an agenda, without a point to make, just proximity. He looked at her. She looked back. "I'm not apologizing for loving you," he said gruffly. "I'm apologizing for the method." "The method," she said, "was terrible." "Yes, you nearly fired a good man. I did fire a good man." "You did," she agreed. "And you offered him money to disappear, which was mites." "Insulting," Wade said from across the table. Gideon looked at him. "Yes, it was." He said it like it cost him $1 a word. "I'm not good at this." "I want that noted." "Noted," Lenora said. "I'm going to get better at it." He said it in the tone he used for operational commitments, not a feeling, a plan. "That's also noted." It was Maisie who cut through it, the way Maisie always cut through things, not rudely, just with the clean surgical precision of someone who goes directly to the thing everyone else is walking around. "So are we leaving?" she said. All 3 adults looked at her. "Because I'd like to stay," she said. "I like it here. I like the horses and the surgery and the foal, and I like it here because of Lenora." She looked at Gideon with the level honesty she gave everyone. "And I think my papa and Lenora should be allowed to figure out what they are, because they both want to and they're both being careful about it because of you." She paused. "No offense." Gideon looked at this child for a long moment. "None taken," he said finally. "You're right, I know," Maisie said, and went back to her mug. The investigation into the fence sabotage took 2 weeks. Gideon moved on it methodically, the way he moved on everything, no drama, just systematic accumulation of evidence. Cutter documented the cut sections before the snow covered them, photographing the angle and spacing. 2 of the neighboring ranchers on the east line reported that one of Keswick's men had been seen on or near boundary areas in the 10 days before the incident. A lawyer from Miles City was engaged and a formal complaint was filed. Roland Keswick did not come to Red Willow to discuss it. He sent a letter through a legal agent that was full of language Wade didn't have patience for, and Gideon had no use for, and the lawyer filed a response that Gideon seemed satisfied with, though he didn't elaborate on why. What happened to Roland Keswick's operation over the following months was the business of Roland Keswick's operation. But 2 ranchers who'd been at the western end of the territory said his cattle numbers had been quietly reduced, and his land was carrying a lien that hadn't been there the previous autumn. The details were nobody's business except the bank's. Gideon did not discuss Roland Keswick again after the lawyer was engaged. Closed that chapter the way he closed chapters completely, without ceremony. What he did instead was go to Wade on a Thursday morning in the corrals and stand watching the gray work through a full pattern all 3 gates, all 4 directions. stops, and starts with the settled responsive quality of an animal that had arrived at Red Willow dangerous and was now the best working horse on the ranch. He watched for 20 minutes. Then he said, "I want to talk to you about the horse operation." Wade brought the gray to a stop. "All right, I've been running my horse program wrong," Gideon said, which was not the kind of sentence that came naturally to him and visibly cost him something to say. "I've been treating it as a subsidiary. Buy horses when I need them, sell the ones I can't use, train them enough to work. There's no program, there's no breeding logic. He gestured at the gray. There's no plan that looks more than one season ahead." "No," Wade agreed. "What you've done with those 3 and 6 weeks is worth more than the 6 months I wasted before you got here." He said it flatly, as a data point. "I want a horse operation that's worth something. A real one breeding, training, reputation. The kind that other ranchers in the territory come to when they need good working horses." He looked at Wade. "I want to know if you can build that." Wade was quiet for a moment. "Build it. It takes time. 2 years before you have a reputation. 3 or 4 before it's generating real income beyond the ranch's own needs." "I know what long-term means," Gideon said. "I built this ranch from post holes." "Then yes, I can build it. I'll pay you fair wages plus a share of the horse program's income as it develops. You manage the program, you make the breeding and training decisions. I provide the capital and the land, and I don't interfere with the method." He paused. "That's the offer. No other conditions attached to it." Wade looked at him. "No other conditions. The other situation," Gideon said, with a particular careful vagueness of a man speaking around something he's not ready to address with full specificity, "is between my daughter and you, and is not my business unless she decides to make it my business. I am removing myself from that particular construction project." He said it like a legal declaration. "Permanently." Wade almost said something. He held it back. "You've got a question," Gideon said. "What changed your mind?" Wade said. "Not about the horse program. About the rest of it." Gideon was quiet for a moment. He looked at the gray horse, which was standing easy, one hip cocked, waiting with the patient quality it had developed over 6 weeks of learning that waiting was often rewarded. "You rode out for a herd that wasn't yours to save," Gideon said. "I've had hired men for 40 years. I've had good ones and poor ones and everything between. In 40 years, I have never had a man ride toward trouble on behalf of my operation after I'd dismissed him the night before and offered him money to leave." He looked at Wade. "That's not calculation. A calculating man would have let the herd go. It would have strengthened his position with Lenora. He could have come back afterward as the man who didn't interfere, who respected a dismissal, who left with his dignity. That would have been the smart play." "I wasn't thinking about smart plays," Wade said. "I know," Gideon said. "That's the point." He put his hand on the fence rail. "The man I picked for Lenora looked at this ranch and saw an asset. The man I told to leave looked at it and saw something worth protecting. That's a difference I can't argue with." He straightened up. "So, do we have an agreement?" Wade looked at the gray horse. He thought about land that had his name on it, somewhere in Wyoming, and about how that had seemed like the thing for so long the destination, the proof that the moving had been worth something. He looked at the corrals and the barn and the mountain line above the valley, and at this difficult, proud, infuriating old man who had just done something genuinely hard and had done it without dressing it up. "We have an agreement," he said. They shook hands across the fence rail. Neither of them made anything of it. Lenora found out about the conversation from Wade that evening. She listened to the full account, the horse program, the conditions, Gideon's explanation of what had changed without interrupting, which was unusual for her and indicated she was taking it seriously. When he finished, she said, "He told you it wasn't his business." Specifically and permanently. He used the word permanently? He did. She was quiet for a moment. He's never used that word about anything he's been wrong about before. He argues and delays and finds a different angle. Permanently means he's actually moved. That's my read too. She looked at him. "How do you feel about it? The program?" "The offer. I feel like it's exactly what I would have built for myself if I'd had the capital to build it," Wade said. "Which I didn't, so you're staying." "I'm staying." She nodded slowly. Something in her face was working through it, all of it, the weeks of it, The weight of the uncertainty and the fighting, and the night in the library, and the cold morning after, the loaded wagon, and the empty decision to unload it again. Maisie will be insufferable about being right, she said. She already knows, Wade said. She was listening from outside the barn. Lenora closed her eyes briefly. Of course she was, she said. And I'm quoting directly, I knew it. I knew it since the first week. Nobody ever believes me. Lenora made a sound that was unambiguously, a laugh genuine, unguarded, the kind that arrived before she could decide whether to have it. Wade had heard that laugh maybe 4 times in 6 weeks, and each time it landed the same way, like something important confirming itself. She's 7, Lenora said. She's 7 going on 45, Wade said. She always has been. Lenora looked at him for a moment with an expression that was complicated and warm and honest, all at once the same face she'd given him in the library when she'd first told him what she felt, simple and without protection. She reached across the space between them and put her hand against the side of his face, which she hadn't done before that specific gesture, quiet and deliberate. I'm glad you didn't take the money, she said. I'm glad Maisie asked the right question, he said. Kept her hand where it was for another moment. Then she dropped it, and they stood in the ordinary cold of the evening with the barn at their backs, and the mountains above, the valley going dark, and neither of them was in a hurry, and neither of them was going anywhere. Maisie appeared at the barn door 10 seconds later, as if she'd been timing it. She looked at both of them. So we're staying, she said. We're staying, Wade said. She nodded with the satisfaction of someone for whom this has been the obvious conclusion for some time, and who has simply been waiting for the adults to catch up. Turned back inside. The foal needs his evening bottle, she called back. Told Lenora I'd do it. Are you coming or not? They went. The foal didn't need a name for the first 6 weeks, because nobody could agree on one. Maisie had 3 candidates and defended each with the systematic logic of someone who had given the matter more thought than most adults give their financial decisions. Wade suggested something plain and got overruled immediately. Lenora said she'd accept whatever Maisie chose, which was the diplomatically correct position, and also, Wade suspected, the position of someone who found the whole debate more entertaining than she was letting on. The foal got named Copper, eventually, because of the way the winter light caught his coat on a January morning when Maisie brought him his bottle, and the sun came through the barn door at exactly the right angle. She stood there looking at him for a moment and said, Copper, and that was that. Nobody argued. Even Wade, who had suggested the name Fletcher and been told Fletcher was not a horse name, admitted that Copper was better. It was a small thing. But small things were the texture of those first months at Red Willow after the storm had passed, and the decisions had been made, and life resumed the shape of something sustainable rather than something held together by emergency. The horse program began in January quietly, the way good operations always begin, not with announcement, but with the unglamorous work of assessment and planning and the patient laying of foundations that nobody would see until something grew from them. Wade spent the first 2 weeks doing nothing but evaluating Red Willow's existing horses with the thoroughness of someone who intends to build on a foundation and needs to know exactly what he has to work with. He made notes in a leather journal Lenora gave him, nothing fancy, just functional, and those notes were not romanticized. 2 of the mares he assessed were too old for a serious breeding program. 1 of the stallions had a conformation flaw that would pass forward. 3 horses that Gideon had purchased based on price rather than quality were good working animals but poor breeding candidates. He told Gideon all of this directly, on a Thursday morning in the library that Gideon had gradually stopped using as a room for difficult conversations and started using as a room for practical ones. Gideon listened. He asked questions. When Wade finished his assessment, Gideon said, So I've been buying wrong for 12 years. You've been buying for what you needed year to year, Wade said. That's not wrong for a cattle operation. It's just not how you build a horse program. What do I need to buy right? 2 mares, young, confirmed well, with working bloodlines that have demonstrated temperament over at least 2 generations. I can tell you where to find them and what to pay. I can also tell you where not to buy them, which is equally useful. And the stallion situation, keep the gray. Gideon looked at him. That horse tried to put 2 men through a fence. That horse, Wade said, is the most intelligent animal on this ranch, And he was being handled by people who treated his intelligence like a problem. It's not a problem, it's the whole point. He met Gideon's eyes. He's got the temperament underneath, once you get past the defensive layer. Any foal he throws is going to have that combination smart and willing, once they trust the person. That's exactly what working ranchers need and almost never find. Gideon was quiet for a moment. You trust him completely. He threw you twice in the first week. And I came back the third day, Wade said. He noticed. Gideon looked out the library window at the corrals, where the gray was visible at the far rail, standing in the January light with the easy posture he'd developed over the past 2 months. Not the rigid watchfulness of an animal on guard. Something settled. All right, Gideon said. Buy the mares, I'll authorize the funds. That was how the Red Willow horse program began. Not with a speech or a ceremony, but with a budget authorization and a man getting on his horse and riding to 3 different ranches over the course of a week, looking at a combined 30 animals and coming back with notes and prices and a recommendation for 2 specific mares that Gideon subsequently purchased without argument. Lenora watched all of this with the particular attention she gave to things she respected. She did not insert herself into Wade's program. She understood that the program needed to be his to be worth anything, and that the worst thing she could do for it was treat it as something they ran together, because it wasn't. It was his expertise, his years, his system. Her role in it was to stay out of it except when asked, and to tell her father the same. She had her own work, and that work was changing shape. Gideon had made a commitment in the library to removing himself from the management of his daughter's life. What he had not accounted for because he was Gideon Strathmore, and accounting for things he hadn't controlled was not his strongest skill, was the vacuum that removal created. Lenora had been running significant portions of Red Willow's cattle operation for 3 years without the title or the formal authority. When Gideon stepped back from the controlling position he'd held, she stepped into the space not because she asked for it, but because she was already there, and the work didn't stop needing to be done. It took Gideon about 6 weeks to notice what had happened. You've been managing the supplier contracts, he said, on a February morning, looking at a ledger that had Lenora's handwriting in it where his had been before. Someone had to, she said. You were busy with the Keswick legal matter. You renegotiated the Harlow feed contract. The previous terms were from 4 years ago, and the market had moved. We were paying 20% over current rate. She looked at him. It saved us money. You didn't tell me you were doing it. You didn't tell me I couldn't. She said it without hostility, just as a fact. You also didn't tell me I could. I decided to treat the silence as permission and handle it. Gideon looked at the ledger. He looked at his daughter. He did the internal accounting that she could always see him doing when he was deciding something, the quiet arithmetic of a man who builds everything by calculating whether it holds weight. How long have you been doing this? He said. The real version. Not the parts I assigned you. Since Mama died, she said. I started covering things she'd been doing that you didn't know she'd been doing. Then I kept going. Gideon sat with that for a while. She was running more than I knew, he said finally. Not quite a question. She was running a great deal, Lenora said carefully. She didn't want you to feel like anything was being taken from you. She just wanted things to work. He was quiet for a long time. She was smarter than me, he said. In certain areas, Lenora agreed. You're better with the cattle. She was better with everything that happens around the cattle. And you? Lenora considered this. I'm better with the cattle than she was. And I'm getting better with the rest of it. She paused. I'd be better faster if I could do it with the title rather than around it. Gideon closed the ledger. He looked at his hands. The old hands, the work-thick ones, that had built everything in this valley from 40 years of not stopping. Ranch manager, he said, formal title. Equal say on operational decisions. Yes, Lenora said. You'll report to me on financial matters above a threshold we establish. Reasonable. And you'll stop doing things without telling me. You stop assuming silence means it's not being done, she said. He almost argued. He stopped himself. Fair, he said. They shook hands across the library table, which would have been peculiar between a father and daughter in most households. But in this one felt exactly right. 2 people who have been negotiating the same territory for years finally drawing an honest map. Spring came to Red Willow, the way it always came to that part of Montana, not gently, but with the grudging incremental retreat of a winter that didn't want to leave. March was cold and argumentative. April softened in the afternoons and froze hard again at night, which was hard on new calves and on people's patience alike. May finally committed, and with it came the smell of the land opening up again. The mud and the grass and the specific atmospheric quality of a place that has been locked down for 5 months and is suddenly, noisily alive. Maisie turned 8 in May. Wade made her a cake with the help of the cook, which was a project involving more negotiation than the Harlow feed contract, and a result that was structurally ambitious and aesthetically uneven but tasted exactly right. Lenora gave her a pair of riding gloves fitted to her hands and a leather-bound notebook with blank pages for whatever she decided to put in it. Gideon, who had not previously been the kind of man who marked children's birthdays with personal attention, gave her a carved wooden horse that one of the hands had made over the winter, a gray horse, specifically, which nobody had asked for and which Gideon presented with the gruff efficiency of someone who has done something sentimental and is not planning to discuss it. Maisie looked at the carved horse for a moment. "Is that copper?" she asked. "It's gray," Gideon said. "Copper's brown." "It's the gray," Maisie said, meaning the real one, the one in the corral. She looked at Gideon with the level gaze she gave things she found significant. "Thank you, Mr. Strathmore." "You can call me something shorter than that if you want," Gideon said, in a tone that was working very hard to be casual about a thing that wasn't casual at all. Maisie thought about it. "What should I call you?" He looked at a point approximately 6 inches above her head. "Whatever seems right," he said, within reason. She called him Gideon for another 3 weeks, trying it out. It didn't quite fit, too formal, too flat. She called him Mr. G for 1 week, which he tolerated with visible restraint. Then one morning in June, she came into the barn while he was checking the new mares and said, without preceding it with anything, "Grandpa Gideon, the gray is favoring his left front leg." Gideon turned to look at her. She looked back, waiting. He went to check the gray's leg. It was a minor stone bruise, nothing serious. He told her it was nothing serious. She nodded and went back to the surgery. He stood in the barn for a moment afterward. Then he went back to work, and neither of them mentioned the name, and it stayed. The conversation between Wade and Lenora that everyone at Red Willow had been waiting for, including, with decreasing patience, Maisie, happened in June, beside the barn where Lenora had first taught Maisie to brush the nervous mare in November. It was evening, warm enough to stand outside without a coat, the mountains holding the last of the light the way mountains do in early summer, keeping it long past when the valley below has given it up. Wade had not planned it for that evening specifically. He had been carrying what he wanted to say for several weeks, turning it over and examining it the way he examined horses looking for the flaw, the unsoundness, the thing that would make it fall apart under real weight. He hadn't found one. Eventually, he decided that looking for reasons not to do something you're certain about is just a different kind of fear, and that he'd had enough fear for one winter. He said, "I want to marry you." Not a question, not a performance. Just a statement of intention, direct and without decoration, the way he said most things. Lenora looked at him. "That's not how you're supposed to do it," she said. "I know how I'm supposed to do it. I decided to tell you what I actually want instead, and then ask if you want the same thing." She was quiet for a moment. The light on the mountains held. "You'd be staying at Red Willow," she said, "building your program on my father's land. Some people would say that's not an independent position for a man to marry from." "Some people would say that," he agreed. "I'd say I'm building something real on ground that makes sense, and that the man who built Red Willow started with borrowed capital and land he didn't own yet either." He looked at her. "Your father isn't doing me a favor. We have an agreement. It's different. You've thought about this. I've thought about everything. That's my main problem, generally." She looked at him for another moment with those honest eyes. Then she said, "Yes. Yes, you want the same thing, or yes, you'll." "Both," she said. "Yes to both." Stop talking. He stopped talking. She crossed the space between them, and he put his hands on either side of her face, and they stood there in the long summer evening light beside the barn where this thing had started, and nothing about it was smooth or scripted. And both of them were slightly awkward about it, in the way of people who are very genuine and have forgotten what to do with that in a moment that deserves it. Maisie appeared at the barn door 45 seconds later. Finally, she said, with the profound satisfaction of someone whose patience has been tested beyond reasonable limits and has now been vindicated. Were you watching? Wade said. I was nearby, Maisie said carefully. That means you were watching. I was nearby and I may have been paying attention. She crossed her arms. You took forever. I want to be a bridesmaid. There will be no bridesmaids, Lenora said. It's going to be small and simple and outside. I want to be something, Maisie said. I'm in it. Whatever it is, I'm in it. You're in everything, Wade said. Good, she said. That's as it should be. She looked at Lenora. I told you, first week. I told Papa you liked each other, and he told me not to manage adults. She tilted her head. I think this proves I was right to manage adults. It proves nothing of the kind, Wade said. It proves everything of the kind, Maisie said cheerfully, and went back into the barn to check on Copper. They told Gideon that evening. After supper, he received the information with the focused attention he gave all significant things, and then he sat with it for a moment in the way he sat with things he was working out the response to. Then he said, I'd like to give you the east parcel. Wade and Lenora both looked at him. 40 acres east of the main operation. Good grass. Spring-fed water access. I was planning to expand the cattle run out there, but he paused. A horse operation needs its own land eventually. Something that's yours, not mine, with your name on the deed. He looked at Wade. I'm not paying for your loyalty. The program earns that piece. I'm acknowledging that a man should have something with his name on it. He said it with the plainness of someone delivering a decision that has been made and examined, and is now final. It's a wedding gift. The parcel and the water rights attached. Wade thought about a piece of ground in Wyoming, somewhere south of Sheridan, that he'd looked at for a fraction of a second before pushing the satchel back across a library table. He thought about how that had felt not like sacrifice, but like simplicity, like a decision that was obvious once you stopped complicating it. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me, Gideon said. Build something on it that's worth the water rights. I intend to. Gideon looked at his daughter. He looked at her the way fathers look at daughters in moments they haven't rehearsed directly, without the buffer of authority or argument, or the careful distance he'd kept for most of her adult life. Your mother would have liked him, he said. She would have liked him immediately, which means I would have resented him immediately, which means he stopped. This would have gone faster, is what I mean. Lenora looked at her father. It went the way it went, she said. Some of it even needed to. He didn't argue with that. They married in July, under the cottonwoods at the south edge of the yard, the old ones. The ones that had been there since before Gideon built the main house, that shaded the east fence in the afternoons and held the light in their leaves in a way that turned everything below them gold in the early evening. It was small, as Lenora had said it would be. The hands came, the ones who'd been at Red Willow long enough to have a stake in things, and they stood in the summer heat with their hats in their hands and watched with the particular quiet of people who have seen enough of life to recognize the real thing when they see it. Maisie stood beside Lenora throughout, in a dress she'd allowed to be made for the occasion, with the specific concession that it not have any ruffles, and she held a small bunch of wildflowers she'd picked herself from the slope above the north pasture. It's the same slope she'd ridden up terrified and alone in November, the same slope she'd come back down from, held between the two people who were now standing in front of her making promises to each other. She thought about that, briefly the symmetry of it. How fear had taken her up that hill, and how something else entirely had brought her down. She didn't have a precise word for what that something else was. She was 8, and her vocabulary was excellent, but some things outran vocabulary no matter how old you were. She held her flowers and watched her father's face when Lenora said yes to the only question that mattered, and she saw on his face the thing that had been missing from it for 3 years, not happiness exactly, which was too simple a word, but the specific quality of a person who has stopped waiting for something bad to happen and has started, tentatively, and with full awareness of what that costs, to trust what's in front of them. She decided later that the word was home. That was the thing that had brought her down the hill. The knowledge that home was waiting for her at the bottom. Gideon stood at the edge of the gathering and watched his daughter marry a man he'd tried twice to get rid of. And he felt the complicated men feel when they've been wrong about something important. And the wrongness has resolved into something better than what they were trying to protect. He had built Red Willow on the principle that a man provides. That provision was the substance of love the land, the wages, the arranged marriage to the appropriate heir, the satchel of money on the table. He had built 40 years on that principle, and it had given him a successful operation, and a daughter who had run it without acknowledgement for 3 years, and a dead wife whose contribution he hadn't fully understood until his daughter told him about it in the library in February. He thought, standing under the cottonwoods, she was running more than I knew. He thought, she didn't want you to feel like anything was being taken from you. He thought, she was smarter than me. He thought that being smarter than someone you love is a lonely thing if the person you love won't let you show it. He thought about how many years he'd taken that from Lenora, not maliciously, not stupidly, but with the particular blindness of a man who has decided he already knows what love looks like and has stopped checking whether he's right. Wade Holleran had arrived at Red Willow with a battered wagon and a horse and 7 years of someone else's debt to love and a 7-year-old daughter with her mother's eyes and more sense than most adults Gideon had ever employed. He had arrived with nothing that Gideon's accounting system recognized as value. And he had been, from the first week, exactly what Gideon had spent 40 years trying to be, a man who stayed when it was hard, who worked without asking what he'd receive, who loved something fiercely and without condition and didn't use that love as leverage. Gideon had looked at that and called it insufficient. He'd been wrong. He'd been wrong the way a man is wrong when he's using the wrong measuring stick, when the thing he's trying to measure doesn't fit the instrument he's built. The foal copper was now a 6-month-old colt with Wade's gray as his primary model and Maisie as his primary human, and he had the combination of qualities that Wade had promised any foal of the gray would have: intelligent, responsive, opinionated about certain things, ultimately trustworthy once trust had been established. He was not an easy horse, he was a good one. The difference between those two things, Wade had come to believe, was the difference between something that flatters you and something that's actually worth something. The first breeding season of the Red Willow horse program produced 3 foals copper +2 from the new mares, both by the gray. All 3 were sound. All 3 showed the temperament Wade had been building toward. He wrote detailed notes on each one in the leather journal and kept records of their early responses to handling, because a breeding program is only as good as its records, and records are only as good as the person honest enough to keep them accurately when the results aren't what you hoped for. 2 of the 3 were better than he'd hoped for. 1 was average, and he wrote that down too, and didn't apologize for it. Ranchers started asking about the Red Willow horses by the following spring, not because anyone had advertised, but because working ranchers notice when a neighboring operation's horses start performing differently, and they ask. And word travels the way word travels in territories where people's livelihoods depend on good information. Wade sold 2 started horses in the spring of the second year, at prices that surprised Gideon and didn't surprise Lenora, who had done the market research and knew what good working horses commanded when they were actually good. The east parcel got fenced in the summer of the first year. Wade did most of it himself, with Cutter helping on weekends, because fence building is the kind of work that a man does on his own land, with his own hands when he's able to, because it means something different done that way. Maisie helped on 2 Saturdays, driving posts with more enthusiasm than technique, and Wade let her do it and corrected the technique without discouraging the enthusiasm, which was the balance he tried for with everything she did. Lenora ran Red Willow's cattle operation with the formal title and authority she'd earned, and it ran better for the formality, not because the work changed, but because the clarity changed, because everyone on the ranch knew who made which decisions, and nobody had to spend energy on the uncertainty of wondering. Gideon stayed involved in the major financial decisions, which was appropriate, and increasingly let the operational ones go, which was also appropriate, and the adjustment between them was not smooth or instant, but was real. And they both worked at it with the stubbornness that was the one trait they completely shared. There were arguments. Gideon and Lenora argued about suppliers, about cattle numbers, about the timing of certain sales. They were sharp arguments sometimes, The kind that come from two competent people who both think they're right and usually both partially are. Lenora won more of them as the years went by, not because she was more forceful, but because her record was better, and Gideon, whatever his faults, was honest enough to follow the record. Wade and Gideon argued less, which was partly because they operated in different domains, and partly because they had settled into a functional understanding that didn't require frequent renegotiation. The understanding was simple. Gideon respected what Wade had built and didn't interfere with it, and Wade respected that Red Willow was Gideon's life's work and didn't treat it like borrowed ground. Both of them kept their side of it. It wasn't warmth, exactly, between them, not in the first years anyway. It was something more durable than warmth. It was respect between two men who see each other clearly and have decided the seeing is enough. Maisie grew. This sounds simple, and it was also the most complicated thing that happened at Red Willow in those years, because Maisie growing meant Maisie becoming, and what she was becoming, was someone who had absorbed the best of every person in that household and was building it into something original. She had Wade's patience and his capacity for long, sustained attention to things that required it. She had Lenora's directness and her refusal to let discomfort prevent honesty. She had her mother's core, that stubborn practical tenderness that saw through performance to the real thing underneath every time. And she had something that was purely her own, a quality that Wade thought of, privately, as fearlessness, though it wasn't that exactly. It was more like she had been scared deeply, specifically, the kind of scared that marks a person when they're small, and she had come through it. And the coming through had given her a knowledge of what fear actually was, that most people don't get until much later. She knew fear was not a stop sign. She knew it was information. She was 9 when she named this out loud, not knowing she was doing anything remarkable. She was talking about the gray horse, who had developed a resistance to a new piece of equipment Wade was introducing, and she said, "He's not being difficult. He's telling you something. The fear is the information." And Wade had looked at his daughter and thought, "Your mother said that first, and you rebuilt it on your own. And that is the most extraordinary thing I have ever seen." She called Lenora Mama for the first time on a Tuesday in October of the second year. Not because anyone suggested it or created a moment for it. Because Maisie had been watching Lenora wrap the sprain on one of the working dogs, the same careful double-layer technique she'd been using since the first week. The same methodical attention. And Maisie said, without looking up from what she was doing, "Mama, do you need the yellow bottle?" Lenora stopped. Maisie looked up and saw her stopped. "Is that—" Maisie started. "Yes," Lenora said. "Yes, I need the yellow bottle." "Thank you." Maisie got the bottle. They finished with the dog. They didn't discuss it. That evening, Lenora told Wade. She told him the way she told him most things plainly in the evening, sitting at the table after Maisie was in bed. She told him, and then she was quiet for a moment, and he could see she was holding the feeling carefully, the way you hold something that is both wonderful and painful. Because it is wonderful, and it is also the space where something absent used to be. She didn't plan it, Lenora said. No, Wade agreed. It just came out. That's the kind that counts, he said. She looked at him. Clara, she said. I think about her sometimes. Whether she'd mind. She wouldn't mind, Wade said. She'd mind Maisie not having someone. You don't know that. I knew her, he said. She'd mind Maisie not having someone. He paused. She'd have opinions about whether you were doing it right. Lenora made a sound that was almost a laugh. What kind of opinions? Detailed ones, he said. Clara had detailed opinions about most things. Where Maisie gets it. They sat with that for a moment, with the presence of someone who wasn't there, who was there anyway, who would always be there in the shape of the daughter she'd left behind. I'm not replacing her, Lenora said, not as a question, as something she needed to say out loud. No, Wade agreed. You're not. Maisie knows that better than either of us. She keeps two things at once better than most adults. He looked at his wife. You're not a replacement. You're what came after. Those are different categories. She nodded slowly. She reached across the table and he took her hand, and they sat there in the ordinary quiet of a house that had people in it who were building something real and knowing it, which is a rarer thing than it sounds. Here is what Red Willow became over those years, and what the people in it became, And what this story is actually about, if you look at it from far enough back to see the shape, it is not a story about a poor man who got lucky. Wade Holleran didn't get lucky. He got the results of who he was applied consistently across months of difficult circumstances. That is not luck. That is the long and unglamorous work of being a particular kind of person when it would have been easier to be a different one. It is not a story about love conquering obstacles, because love doesn't conquer obstacles. Love is the thing you have while you're doing the work of dealing with the obstacles yourself. The obstacles Gideon's pride, Roland Keswick's calculation, the cold, the fear, the satchel of money on the library table, those were dealt with by human beings making human decisions. The love was what made the decisions worth making. It is not a story about a little girl who needed saving. Maisie Holleran saved nobody and needed nobody to save her. What she needed was the same thing every person needs, and most people spend their entire lives either finding or not finding, a place where she was seen accurately and loved anyway. Not idealized, not managed. Seen. That's all. It turns out to be enough when you actually get it. What Gideon Strathmore learned what it cost him, specifically, to learn it is worth saying plainly. He learned that provision is not the same as love, and that the difference between them is the difference between building something for someone and building something with them. He had built Red Willow. He had built it for Lenora, in the sense that he intended her to inherit it. But he had never, until the winter of Wade Holleran, built anything with her. The formal title in February was the beginning of that. It was late. It was still worth doing. Gideon held Maisie's carved gray horse in his hands one evening, 3 years after he'd given it to her, after she'd left it on the library table while she went to help Wade in the corral. Turned it over and looked at the work in it, the hand that had made it, the specific care of the detail, the gray horse caught in motion. He thought about what he'd said when he gave it to her. Whatever seems right, within reason. He thought about a 7-year-old girl sitting at his kitchen table in the dark of a December morning, cold from a hill she'd ridden up, scared and ridden down held, eating soup and watching every adult in the room with those careful eyes. He thought, I was watching everything. He thought, I almost missed it anyway. That is the particular danger of watching, that you can watch something clearly, see it accurately, and still let your own prior conclusions overrule what you're seeing. Gideon had watched Wade from the first day and had seen accurately a man of quality. And then he'd spent 2 months trying to believe that quality was insufficient because it didn't come attached to land. The land was the thing that had always told Gideon the truth about a man. He'd built his whole accounting system on land. And along came a man who had none, and a 7-year-old who didn't care, and a daughter who'd been trying to tell him, for years, that the measuring stick was wrong. He set the carved horse back on the table. He went outside and stood in the summer evening air of the valley he'd built, and looked at the corrals where the gray moved freely, and at the east parcel's fence line that someone had built with his own hands on a summer Saturday, and at the light in the surgery window where it was always lit when there was work to be done, which was most of the time. He had arrived at Red Willow 40 years ago with a borrowed horse and a surveyor's map, and the absolute conviction that land was the answer to every question. He had not been entirely wrong about that. He had been wrong about which questions. Wade Holleran had arrived at his gate in the autumn of 1889, with a battered wagon and a tired horse and a 7-year-old daughter holding his hand, and Gideon had looked at all of it and seen nothing worth keeping. He understood now what he'd been looking at. He'd been looking at a man who already had the thing Gideon had spent 40 years trying to build, not the land, not the cattle, not the reputation, but the thing underneath all of it. The thing you can't buy and can't deed, and can't arrange through a banker or a marriage contract. He'd been looking at a man who knew what home meant. And the rancher's daughter had seen it on that first morning, in the way he stood in the cold with his hat in his hands and asked for work instead of charity. And she had made her decision then, even if it had taken the rest of the winter to say so. Some things take the whole winter. Some things are worth the wait.